Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Before we get into today's video, I just want to give a shout out and a big thank you to all of our patrons and all of our members who support this channel. Your support goes a long way to making these daily videos possible. And I throwed up some of those names up on the screen, our producer and executive producer level patrons. But thank you to everybody. And thank you to everyone who likes, who has subscribed, who leaves comments. All of those things tremendously help. And watching the video all the way through helps as well. We're going to dive into one of my favorite historical figures today, and I thought it was a good time to do it because I did a short a while back that's gotten well over 500,000 views now, talking about how Ulysses S. Grant was recently given a promotion to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. Not to be confused with General of the Army, which is a 5-star rank that has been given to people like MacArthur, Marshall, Hap Arnold, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Bradley. Those are the 5 who have ever received that rank. General of the Armies of the United States has been conferred 3 times. First on General John J. Pershing, then on George Washington in the 1970s, and then just a couple of months ago on Ulysses S. Grant. It's higher than 5 stars, so we can kind of call it a 6-star, but there's no official insignia or no official stars given to it. But there seems to be a lot of confusion about that, and I've also gotten a lot of hate from people commenting on that, saying, oh, Grant is spewing the typical lost cause narrative, which is Grant was a butcher who really wasn't a good general. He just bludgeoned the South to death with numbers and resources, which is baloney. Yes, he had numbers and resources, but he also was actually a very brilliant strategist, and hopefully we'll get into some of that today. So we're going to take a look at Ulysses S. Grant, victor of the American Civil War. We're going to be looking at the channel Biographics, Simon Whistler, beard and all. So I'll put the link down in the description if you want to see the original content without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive in.
This video is brought to you by Blinkist. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/biographics will get 1 week to try it out for free. They'll also get 25% off the cost of a full membership. More on them in a bit. The American Civil War was the worst cataclysm in the history of the United States. Americans killed each other by the hundreds of thousands, burned and destroyed their own cities, and nearly tore the entire country in two. In the process, it made many men into heroes on both sides, and one of the foremost of these is Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War saved Grant from a life of failure and obscurity. His brilliant tactical and strategic acumen would see him rise to command the entire Union Army, matching wits with the South's Robert E. Lee. He oversaw the final victory of the North over the South, destroying the institution of slavery in the United States forever. He helped to oversee the reconstruction of the South, first as commanding general and then as president of the United States. He helped rebuild the economy of the country, creating the Department of Justice to fight the Ku Klux Klan, and he laid the foundation of the modern federal government by establishing the Civil Service Commission. And yet Grant died almost penniless, and in historical analysis of his life, more emphasis is given to his shortcomings and failures than to his successes.
That's actually a fantastic introduction to the man. I think that covers all the bases pretty well. People love to focus on, oh, he was a bad president because of the corruption in his government. Oh, he was a drunk who just drank all the time. They so focus on things that really are not as much a part of his character as people give them credit for. Absolutely true, everything he just described. I think Grant is one of those people who in more recent years seems to be, the opinion and the view of him seems to be changing. I think, to be more accurate. It's not a revision of history, it's a writing of history. And people are always asking me for suggestions for books. 2 books I highly recommend on this subject. Ron Chernow's biography of Grant is phenomenal and completely revolutionized my own thinking about the man, Grant. And I'm sure we're going to learn a lot of what Chernow writes about. And Grant's autobiography, which will be talked about for sure, is also fantastic and really, really, really well done.
Critics have called him a drunk, a butcher, a corrupt politician. Only recently has his reputation begun to be rehabilitated. So why was history so unkind to Ulysses S. Grant? And what is the real story behind?
Why was history so unkind? As we've been addressing in comments sections for other videos, people have been saying history is written by the victors. And yes, that's true to an extent. But history's not always written by the victors. And especially more in modern times, I think we need to get away from the idea that the only narrative we're going to hear is by the victors. Because we're at a time and place in history where people can get their narratives out there, even if they're completely baseless. And the perfect example of that is the post-Civil War idea that we know as the lost cause, which is the real source of this idea that Grant was a butcher, Grant was a drunk, Grant had no idea what he was doing. He basically stumbled into victory over Lee because the South just couldn't withstand the numbers. So it's absolutely true.
Finds his remarkable life. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born on April the 22nd, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio, a small community on the Ohio River located 25 miles southeast of Cincinnati. His father, Jesse, operated a tannery, which young Ulysses hated. Local children made fun of his naivety, calling him Useless Grant. But the young Grant developed an affinity for taming and riding horses, something that served him well throughout his life.
So why do they call him Useless Grant if his name was Hiram? Well, very early on in life, Grant, he didn't like the idea that his initials spelled the word hug, H-U-G, for Hiram Ulysses Grant. So early on in life, he started going by Ulysses, or Ulyss, he was often called. So he knew himself as Ulysses Hiram Grant. Of course, that gets changed when he goes to West Point. His father's involved in politics, very staunchly abolitionist family. His dad ends up the mayor of Georgetown, which is the town he grows up in outside of Cincinnati. And the family had originally been in Northeast Ohio, not far from me here. In fact, Grant's grandmother's buried just a few miles away from me here in Northeast Ohio. And they were neighbors and acquaintances of John Brown's family when they were in the Akron area.
Jesse Grant, figuring his son wasn't destined for the life of a merchant, wrote to his congressman and secured an appointment for Ulysses to the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1839.
So, and the reason for that is Jesse wanted Ulysses to have a good education. He didn't think he was going to get that from any kind of a public school. But he also couldn't afford to send him to a good private school. And so he saw West Point as a good educational opportunity for Ulysses. Grant didn't want to go. He had no interest whatsoever in wanting to go to West Point. And in fact, he talks about this, about how when he was on his way to West Point, which is quite a journey from southwest Ohio to upstate New York, or up the Hudson River, New York. It's not really upstate. It's not far from New York City, really. But there was some talk that they were going to shut West Point down. And Grant found himself hoping that he would arrive at West Point to find out the news that they had indeed shut it down. But that wasn't to be.
When he was enrolled in West Point, a clerical error was made listing his name as Ulysses S. Grant. Rather than fighting to have it changed, Grant lived with it and went by the name for the rest of his life.
And sometimes you see it written as Ulysses Simpson Grant, and his mother's maiden name was Simpson. And so it was a common assumption that was his middle name, because that's a very common thing people would do, would be to name a son with the middle name being the mother's maiden name, or even sometimes the first name being the mother's maiden name. My grandma's brother, his middle name was Chambers, which was their mother's maiden name. So people thought it was Ulysses Simpson. They started calling him Uncle Sam Grant at West Point, and that got shortened to Sam. So a lot of his friends, a lot of the guys he went to West Point with, called him Sam Grant for the rest of his life.
His friends at the academy nicknamed him Uncle Sam Grant because his new initials were US and just later shortened it to Sam. He was an indifferent student, graduating in the middle of his class in 1843, but while he was there, he became acquainted with many of the officers he would either serve with or fight against during the Civil War. The class of 1843 produced 15 Union generals and 3 Confederate generals out of 39 graduates. Grant's closest friends at the academy were Frederick Dent and James Longstreet, who both became generals, one in the North and one in the South.
And they were actually related to each other. Frederick Dent's going to become Grant's brother-in-law, and Longstreet was a cousin of theirs and was present for Grant's wedding to Julia Dent out in Missouri, who comes from a slave family. I'm sure they're going to talk about this. But one more thing about his West Point service, or West Point time. He was an average student, but he was really good in some areas and then not so good in some other areas of study. And Grant actually hoped after West Point that he would actually come back to West Point as a professor. I think of mathematics or something. And he would have done very well at that. And that was actually kind of his career goal at that point, was to be a professor at West Point. And I think he would have done very well at that. But the Mexican War breaks out and changes the trajectory of his life.
It wasn't long after graduating that young Grant became swept up in the great political event of the 1840s, the Mexican-American War,
which he opposed. Yep. And it should be noted that he had been stationed in Missouri, I think Jefferson Barracks. I want to say he was with the 4th Infantry, or maybe that comes later. But he actually meets his wife, Julia, before the war. And they're kind of working toward getting married. Julia's family not a huge fan of this Ohio kid from an abolitionist family when Julia's family are slave owners. And so her father, Colonel Dent, didn't really care for him. And they kind of pushed it off, and then the war gets in the way and kind of puts everything on hold.
In 1836, citizens of the Mexican province of Texas revolted against Mexico, defeating the army of General Santa Anna and winning independence. Texas was, in turn, annexed by the United States in 1845. This immediately sparked tensions with the Mexican government. General Santa Anna was still in power and was humiliated by his defeat at the hands of the Texans. What's worse, the Republic of Texas claimed its border extended all the way down to the Rio Grande, a claim adopted by the United States after it annexed Texas. Mexico still viewed this as its territory and vowed to defend it. James K. Polk had been elected president of the United States in 1844 on a vow to expand the territory of the United States by any means necessary under the philosophy of manifest destiny. He was spoiling for a fight, and in 1846 he finally got one when the United States went to war against Mexico. The U.S. Army invaded Mexico, striking out for Mexico City. One of the men in General Zachary Taylor's army was Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, assigned as a quartermaster. He distinguished himself at the Battle of Monterey, riding a horse past enemy snipers to deliver a dispatch for
Let's talk about this a little more. And if you've seen the History Channel documentary on Grant, which I highly recommend, they portray this scene pretty accurately. No lie, Grant legit did the thing you see in movies, right, where he side saddles the horse and he rides down on one side so they can't see him and shoot at him. He rides right out of where they're being surrounded to go secure supplies. He was itching to be a part of the action, and he had been assigned as a quartermaster, the supply guy. And so he wasn't given a frontline command, and that really aided Grant, who wanted that chance for glory and that chance for leadership. And so that gave him that opportunity to do that. And he actually serves again alongside of a lot of the guys that are later going to become part of the Civil War. But yeah, he showed incredible bravery. And this is when Grant discovers something really important about his own character, which is that he's incredibly cool under fire. Like, some people get rattled by chaos and war and bullets whizzing, and some people, they just don't. And Grant was one of those people who just was very calm, collected, could think clearly. Some people actually said during the Civil War that it seemed like Grant had better focus when there was stress.
Reinforcements. Grant's unit was transferred to a new army commanded by General Winfield Scott, who invaded Veracruz from the sea, heading towards the Mexican capital. Scott took the city in late 1847, and the United States forced Mexico to cede not only the territory claimed by Texas, but the provinces of California and New Mexico as well, ending the war in February 1848. Grant had distinguished himself during Scott's campaign and came out of the war with the rank of captain. The Mexican War had given Grant and many other future Civil War commanders valuable combat experience. At one point during the war, Grant met another Mexican war hero, a lieutenant colonel named Robert E. Lee. But Grant, like many others, thought the war to be morally unjust. He saw it for what it was, a war of territorial expansion, of conquest, which isn't something a democratic republic like the United States should be engaged in.
And this is something important to note about Grant, is that I feel like he was a pretty consistent guy in his principles through most of his life. And he was also somebody who would sometimes make mistakes, but I think did a decent job of learning from those. But like everybody, he had blind spots. And for Grant, one of the blind spots in his life was that he was very naive when it came to people taking advantage of him. And this was a common theme throughout his life, is that he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted, and they ended up burning him because of it.
Later, he would opine that the Civil War was divine retribution for the country's aggression against Mexico. The war with Mexico, rather than uniting the country behind a common cause, only deepens the regional tensions between the North and the South. Slavery hung over the country like a sword of Damocles, driving the country further apart. Ulysses S. Grant experienced this strife personally soon after the end of the war. When Grant returned home in 1848, he married Julia Dent, the sister of his friend and classmate Frederick. His father refused to attend the wedding, not because he disapproved of the marriage, but because the Dent family were prominent Missouri slaveholders, and Jesse Grant was an ardent abolitionist. Grant was transferred from one desolate army post to another on the frontiers of the country. Separated from his family and bored with the mundane nature of day-to-day barracks life, Grant began to drink to excess.
At one point, Grant's unit is transferred all the way to the west, to the Pacific coast. And they go south and cut across Panama to get there. There's no Panama Canal at the time. But they go down, take a land route across Panama, and then they're going to take water up the other side because it's safer than going all the way across the country in the 1840s and early 1850s. And a big chunk of Grant's unit and a bunch of civilians who are traveling with them end up dying, I think, of malaria during all of this. And it's a small miracle that Grant made it to the Pacific without dying himself. But yeah, he's separated from his wife, and by this point they've got one, maybe two kids. And it's typically when things are really boring and there's not much going on that we find that Grant drinks. I don't understand exactly the terminology and whether Grant's an alcoholic or not. I'll leave to others who understand better. But really, Grant's more of a binge drinker. He's not somebody who drank all the time. He was a guy who, when he did drink, he went on a bender for a day or two. And he also couldn't hold his liquor. He'd have one strong drink and he was out. Like, that really hit him hard. So he didn't drink all the time. But when he did drink, it was bad.
This got him into trouble, and he was forced to resign his army commission in 1854. He returned home, then made a go at farming, building a home he called Hardscrabble on land given to him by his father-in-law. It was a failure, and Grant at one point was so poor that he pawned his gold watch to buy Christmas presents for his children.
And he also, at one point, was seen going into town and selling firewood because he was so desperate. He would chop down trees on his property and then go and try and sell the firewood to try and make money. Grant is one of those classic examples of people who are super good at one thing and pretty much terrible at everything else.
In late 18...
I shouldn't say one thing. I think it's been described that Grant was good at two things, being a soldier and being a husband. And that was about it.
1858, after his farm failed, his father-in-law gave him a slave named William Jones. Slaves were incredibly valuable property.
Yes.
Grant could have gotten up to $1,000 for Jones if he had sold him a large amount of money when the average salary was less than $20 a month.
And at a time when Grant was desperate for money, so this is a perfect example, again, of Grant's character. He could sell William Jones, make $1,000, which is several years of money, and finally maybe be able to relax and rest easy a little bit. But he's not willing to do that.
But Grant, although not a political abolitionist like his father, was personally opposed to the practice, and in March 1859 he set William Jones free. By the end of 1860, Grant had been reduced to a position as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Illinois. Grant didn't support Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election that year, but was still appalled by the secession of the southern states in the beginning of the Civil War in April 1861. When Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, Grant decided to put his army uniform back on to join the fight.
Yeah, so Grant, by his own admission, he did not support Lincoln. He's from Illinois, and there were two Illinois presidential candidates, Stephen Douglas, who was running for the Democrats, and was one of the candidates running for the Democrats, and Lincoln running for the Republicans. And Grant, though he wasn't eligible to vote, I don't think, because he had just moved to Galena and had not established himself to be able to vote in that election. But I think he said he would have voted for Douglas. But the Civil War kind of pushed everybody to choose sides, right? And a lot of the folks who were Douglas Democrats end up supporting the Republicans. Even Douglas became very supportive of Lincoln during the war, even though he died pretty early on into it and was a friend to Lincoln.
Grant owed his recommissioning to the patronage of Congressman Elihu B. Washburn of Illinois, who knew Grant as a fellow Galena resident. Washburn secured Grant's appointment first as colonel of a regiment of Illinois volunteers and then as a brigadier general.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is true for a lot of folks in the Civil War. Connections get them opportunities they might not have otherwise had. A guy like Sherman, for example, probably never rises through the ranks if not for some of the connections he made. His brother is a senator from Ohio, and so he's got some good political connections. Irvin McDowell, who is the first Union general in northeastern Virginia and leads the army into the Battle of Bull Run, gets that appointment over other people who probably were better suited for it because of some political connections he had. But in Grant's case, it starts out with that political connection that gets him an opportunity, but then he rises through the ranks based on his ability. Starts out as this colonel, I think, of the 21st Illinois Infantry, and they say that, okay, first he gets that, then he gets brigadier general, but part of the reason why is because he did such a great job instilling discipline in these volunteers that it was noticed by some of the higher ups in Illinois, and they thought, well, if he can do it with a regiment, what could he do with a department? A lot of the commands at this point are departments. They're geographical rather than commands of an army. Now, there's armies within that. So, for example, Don Carlos Buell commands the Army of the Ohio because he's in command of the Department of the Ohio. And so he commands the army that is made up of troops that are within his district. So Grant's given command of this small area down around Cairo, Illinois, down at the southern tip of Illinois. And that gives him his first opportunities, and then he starts rising up and getting more opportunities.
He engaged in some small battles with the Confederate forces in southeastern Missouri and in Kentucky,
Belmont.
and in February 1862 conceived of a plan to capture two important Confederate river forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. He captured both of them, demanding immediate and unconditional surrender from Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner and his army of 12,000 inside Fort Donelson.
So, Grant, one of the initial things that he does that shows some of his brilliance is he's one of the first on the Union side to really recognize the importance, especially in the Western theater, of the Army and the Navy coordinating and working together. And Grant does a really good job of working with the Navy in developing these plans, using gunboats to go down the river. And by taking Forts Henry and Fort Donelson, he opens up the path to Nashville. And once Fort Donelson falls, the Confederates know they can't hold Nashville because they can't hold the river, because Fort Donelson is protecting the river. And Simon Bolivar Buckner, there's actually some history between him and Grant. Several years earlier, Grant, in one of his financial strains, had actually borrowed money from Buckner, who he knew from back before the war. And Buckner thought that because of that he'd get favorable terms from Grant. And so he was a little surprised when Grant said, no terms but immediate and unconditional surrender will be accepted. And that puts him on the radar and makes him a hero in the North when they desperately needed one.
It was the first Union triumph of the war, and newspapers nicknamed him Unconditional Surrender Grant. Promoted to Major General, Grant was put at the head of the Army of the Tennessee, some 40,000 strong. From Fort Henry, he moved south along the Tennessee River and encamped at Pittsburgh Landing near a small meeting house called Shiloh Church.
Shiloh.
There he was to wait and link up with the Army of the Ohio, commanded by Don Carlos Buell, advancing south from Nashville, and then together they would march on the city of Corinth, Mississippi. The Confederate general, Albert Sidney Johnston, wasn't going to sit around and wait for Grant to be reinforced. His army of Mississippi was of a comparable strength to Grant's, and he resolved to take the Union army by surprise, cut it off from the river, and destroy it.
Yeah, and it was a good plan because he knew that by sitting there waiting, the combined strength of Grant and Buell would be too much for him. So he heads out from Corinth, which is in right north Mississippi, just maybe 20 miles from Shiloh, and he gets slowed down by rain. If it hadn't been for the rain, he probably hits Grant, probably destroys Grant's army, and we never hear of General Grant much after that. But Grant is able to hold off long enough let Buell arrive, and then they're able to counterattack and win.
Just before 6 a.m. on April the 6th, 1862, Johnston's army was arrayed for battle less than 2 miles from the Union Army, who didn't realize that they were coming. Grant decided to entrench his position because his army was green and he figured what they needed was more practice with their guns, not with their shovels. This was the start of a habit with Grant to concern himself more with his own plans than those of his enemy.
That's true, and that's one of the mistakes Grant's gonna make early in the war, is that he had been advised that he should dig in and build defensive positions, and it would have worked out had he done that, but he decided not to. He didn't think that they were going to be there long enough. He really didn't prepare well, but he learns from this. But to say that they didn't know Johnston was coming, I think might not be entirely true. I think this idea that the Grant got surprised at Shiloh is a little bit overblown, because there were plenty of warnings that they were coming, and they had pickets out, and the pickets encountered them early in the morning. I just don't think he expected the Confederate Army to attack with a total onslaught with their entire force the way they did, as quickly as they did.
When it worked out well. When it didn't, it could be disastrous. By 7 a.m., the Confederates were attacking the Union lines. The Union men were taken completely by surprise, and many initially broke and ran. Other units stood and fought, but were pushed back under heavy fire. The fighting was ferocious, close-range musketry blasting entire lines of soldiers to bits on both sides. Key to the defense was one of Grant's division commanders, General William T. Sherman, who seemed to be everywhere on his part of the battlefield.
And Sherman, I know we're talking about Grant, but Sherman at this point has already used up several chances. He was a brigade commander at the Battle of Bull Run in the Eastern Theater back in July of 61. And he was screaming from the rooftops that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war, and that the Union was going to need to do a lot to win. It wasn't going to be the simple, everybody home by Christmas war that people were saying it was. And he also dealt with some pretty severe mental health issues. A lot of people thought he was crazy. I don't think he was crazy, but he definitely dealt with depression, some mental health issues, and he'll end up losing a couple of children who died during the war. Not because of the war, but who die from illness, young children. But he very famously would later say that he stuck by Grant when he was drunk, and Grant stuck by him when he was crazy, and now they stick by each other always. And this is really when that partnership begins to show fruit.
He continuously rallied his men into a stubborn defense, was wounded twice, and had 3 horses shot out from under him. Nonetheless, the Confederates continued to advance until noon, when their advance began to slow, not only due to the Union resistance, but because the Confederates had overrun the Union camp, and many soldiers who had run out of rations stopped to plunder food. The Confederates were further delayed by a Union division commanded by Benjamin Prentiss, who put up a stubborn defense at a place called the Hornet's Nest for several hours.
So if you ever get the chance to go to the Shiloh battlefield, and I'm planning to go back and do a multi-video series from there. I've got one video I made in Shiloh. I was only there for a couple hours. But you'll learn very quickly that the terrain really worked against the Confederates, because their entire attack is uphill steadily. It's through woods and then into clearings and then woods again. And it's very difficult to be able to kind of coordinate the army, because you can only see a little bit at a time because of the way the woods and the clearings are broke up. And because it's steadily uphill, the closer you got to Pittsburgh Landing, the more uphill you were going, and the more you were dealing with the Union increasingly building a stronger defensive position. And so it was a very difficult ask for the Confederate Army to continue to attack after they had been fighting for 5, 6, 7 hours already.
Rather than bypass it, the Confederates kept charging it and taking heavy casualties. Prentiss eventually ran out of ammunition and had to surrender his 2,000 men, but he bought enough time for Grant to establish a firm defensive position near Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederate cause was weakened still further by the death of their commanding general. Johnston had been wounded behind his right knee and didn't realize how much he was bleeding because the blood filled his boot where no one could see it.
Almost certainly caused by friendly fire. If you go to the Shiloh battlefield, that's what the Rangers will tell you there, the park guys. That's what the signs will tell you. It's what I think most of the evidence points to, is that he was shot behind the knee, probably by one of his own men behind him.
With no doctor to attend to him, he bled to death on the field. Command now passed to General P.G.T. Beauregard, famous as the man who fired the first shot on Fort Sumter that began the war a year before. Beauregard sent a telegram to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, announcing a complete victory. "I have Grant just where I want him, and can finish him up in the morning." Fighting paused for the night as both sides caught their breath. It started to rain, and the wet weather, combined with the cries of the wounded, made for a miserable night for both sides. General Sherman found Grant standing under a tree, sheltering from the rain and smoking a cigar. "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?"
Love this
Sherman
quote.
said. Grant, coolly puffing his cigar, replied, "Yes.
Lick 'em tomorrow, though."
Another general
Love it.
might have thought the prudent thing to do was to retreat, or at least remain on the defensive. But Grant was being reinforced throughout the night by 20,000 fresh troops as Buell's army arrived. And he was not a general that enjoyed being on the defensive. On that morning, April the 7th, it was Grant's turn to attack, and it was the Confederates' turn to be surprised. All day, there was more vicious fighting, until Beauregard's army was driven from the field and the Union army was left where it had started the day before. The cost of the Battle of Shiloh shocked the nation. 13,000 Union and 10,700 Confederate, by far the bloodiest battle of the war to date.
Not only the bloodiest battle of the war, but at that point, the casualties, the battle, wounds, and deaths at Shiloh, pretty much equal or surpassing the battle, wounds, and deaths of all U.S. wars combined. In 2 days, it just shocked the nation. And Grant, there was a lot of calls for Grant's removal after Shiloh, despite the fact that he won the battle, because of how it went down and because of the casualties. And he actually is kind of temporarily removed because Henry Halleck, who was his superior, Grant's department had a bigger department that was over it, and Halleck was over that full department. So Halleck comes and actually is present with Grant's army and Buell's army as they march on the siege of Corinth. And Grant's pretty much ready to give up and go home because he feels like he's basically been relegated to like the vice presidency, right? He's in second in command and has no authority and can't make any decisions.
The newspapers that had commended Grant in February now castigated him, blaming him for the high casualty counts and for being surprised on the first day of the battle. The fact that he rallied in the night and won the battle on the second day was largely overlooked. Reporters spread rumors that Grant was drunk during the battle. In fact, while Grant had a problem with alcohol his entire life, it is well known that he never drank while in battle or in the middle of a campaign. Nonetheless, Henry Halleck, the commander of the Union armies in the West, who personally despised and was perhaps jealous of Grant, used the battle to try...
I think maybe it wasn't quite that bad. I think there are times when you see Halleck do things that could lead somebody to the conclusion that he despised Grant. And Halleck was known as old brains because he was, on paper, he was a brilliant general. He was good at logistics and things like that. And that's why he'll end up being the chief of staff for the U.S. Army, and he'll have a desk job for the rest of the war because that's where he thrived. And he's married to Alexander Hamilton's granddaughter, which I always thought was really interesting. But so, yeah, he's not a strategist. He's not a field commander. And there were times when he kind of stepped on Grant when Grant was ready to move, and he kind of held Grant back. But give Halleck credit because eventually he recognizes Grant's abilities and actually supports him.
Try and force Grant out of the army. Abraham Lincoln interceded on Grant's behalf. "I can't spare this man,"
He fights.
he said. He fights.
It's Vicksburg, yep.
After being temporarily removed from command, Grant considered resigning from the army in the aftermath of Shiloh. It was Sherman who convinced him to stay, and soon Grant was back in action. In January 1863, Grant's Army of the Tennessee was to take the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was the last Confederate strong point on the Mississippi River.
Not quite. There were still 2 Confederate strong points on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is by far the strongest, but there's also a strong point further down in northern Louisiana. The Navy, the U.S. Navy, had pretty much single-handedly taken the city of New Orleans, which is by far the largest city in the Confederacy, and they had actually attempted to take Vicksburg as well, but it didn't work out. And Grant will actually try multiple times to get at Vicksburg, because Vicksburg is really like this strong position that's on bluffs that overlooks the Mississippi River, and it's hard to get at it from too many places. And so he tries from different ways to get at it. And there's this disastrous battle at Chickasaw Bayou in December of 62 where Sherman is trying to get at Vicksburg from the north, and he fails. And so Grant is trying to crack this nut any way he can, and he eventually is able to do that in a brilliant campaign.
If it was taken by the Union, the Confederacy would be cut in half. With Union naval vessels blockading all southern ports, it would also remove the only overland route that the Confederacy had to get supplies in from overseas. Vicksburg wasn't an easy fortress to crack, though. It was located on high hills that overlooked the river, making it difficult to approach by ship. The land to the north was an impassable maze of swamps, rivers, and bayous, and the Confederates had about 30,000 troops garrisoned there under the command of General John C. Pemberton. And to make
So Pemberton, first of all, not the same John C. Pemberton who invented Coca-Cola. Okay, a lot of people confuse that. That guy was, I think, a Confederate veteran, but he's not John C. Pemberton that was in command at Vicksburg. Pemberton, born in Pennsylvania, but serves the Confederacy, had been put in charge of building fortifications on the Atlantic coast, but he was a favorite of Jefferson Davis, and Davis tended to play favorites, and that meant sometimes not giving command to competent commanders. Like, he always kind of held back Joseph Johnston, who Grant felt was the Confederacy's best general, not Lee, Joseph Johnston, because he didn't like him. But he loved Pemberton, and Pemberton had no business being in command of such an important defensive position like Vicksburg, and that's going to really haunt the Confederates.
Things worse, Grant's army was on the opposite side of the river as the city. Initially, nothing Grant tried worked. He attempted to dig canals, traverse bayous, and other attempts to get his army close enough to the city without exposing it to the fort's guns. Eventually, he decided on a bold strategy. He would march his army down south of Vicksburg, cross the river there, and then march north to attack Vicksburg from the east. To do it, Admiral Porter's gunboats needed to brave Vicksburg's defenses to be in a position to ferry Grant's army across the river.
And I did an entire series retracing the steps of this campaign, going to the places where they ran the guns, and going to the places where Grant landed his army and where he marched north. If you want to check that series out, it's from a couple years ago, so it's one of my older series on this channel on site videos. So you'll notice, I think the production quality, hopefully has stepped up a few notches since then, but I still think that the information's really good, and I'll put a link in the description and at the end of the video if you want to check that out.
On April the 16th, 10 boats made the attempt. Admiral Porter saw that the Confederate shells were hitting the tops of his ships, so he maneuvered them as close to the shore on the same side as Vicksburg as he could. Grant watched in satisfaction as the majority of the shells flew harmlessly overhead and missed the boats. Only 1 out of the 10 boats didn't make it. 6 more.
Yeah, they couldn't depress the guns from their heights down low enough to hit the gunboats.
4 boats went past Vicksburg on April the 22nd. Again, only 1 of them was destroyed. On April the 29th, Grant's army started crossing the Mississippi. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, Grant waged a brilliant campaign, outmaneuvering his Confederate opponents and preventing the garrison at Vicksburg from being reinforced, then defeated Pemberton's army at the Battle of Champion Hill.
So, a couple of things about that. Number one, most brilliant campaign of the war. By far. What Grant does once he lands on the eastern side of the Mississippi, in Mississippi, and marches his army, fights, 5 battles, while traversing some horrible terrain, some of the worst terrain I've ever seen on Civil War battlefields, at places like Grand Gulf. Just ridiculous what they had to march through. Doing this in the Mississippi humidity with wool uniforms on, even though it was only May, it was still pretty brutal, I'm sure. Taking on Confederate forces that pretty much equaled him in size. It's not until they lay siege to Vicksburg and he starts getting reinforcements that he starts to outnumber the Confederates. And the Battle of Champion Hill might be the most important battle of the American Civil War, and nobody really knows much about it.
His army surrounding Vicksburg, and after 2 assaults failed to carry the city, he settled in for a siege. Finally, on July the 4th, Pemberton was forced to surrender the city and its garrison of 20,000 men. But it was just 1 day after Robert E. Lee's army had been defeated at Gettysburg, and most people received the news of both battles at the same time, causing jubilation in the north and despair in the south. Grant was now promoted to command of all the armies in the Western Theater of War, and was sent to deal with another pressing situation in Tennessee. In September 1863, the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by William Rosecrans, had been defeated by Confederate General Braxton Bragg at the Battle of Chickamauga.
And let's just take a moment to recognize the special kind of bad that you have to be as a general to get beat by Braxton Bragg. Now, Rosecrans had been fairly competent as a general until Chickamauga. Chickamauga is a complete debacle for the Union, and that's why you see most of the higher command in the Army of the Cumberland get removed. I think not only Rosecrans, but I think 2 of the Corps commanders as well. General Thomas is the only Corps commander that's going to hang on to his job after that because he's the only one who didn't flee from the battlefield. But that's when Grant has to come in and kind of save the day at Chattanooga.
Rosecrans had retreated to the city of Chattanooga, followed by Bragg, who put the city under siege. Grant went to Chattanooga with all available forces to break the siege and defeat Bragg. It was here that Grant found himself opposed by his old friend James Longstreet for the first time. Longstreet had been serving in Robert E. Lee's army in the east, but was sent to Tennessee to reinforce Bragg, and was now one of Bragg's lieutenants. Grant, never one for defensive warfare, sent his army out to the trenches to attack Bragg's forces. In 2 battles, on November the 24th and the 25th, Grant defeated Bragg, first at Lookout Mountain and then at Missionary Ridge, routing the Confederates with heavy losses.
And one of the guys under Grant in those attacks, Joseph Hooker. Hooker's another one of those guys that you think about a lot of the Union Army commanders out east of the Army of the Potomac who get removed from command, and then you don't always hear from them after that. Guys like McClellan, for example. But Hooker ends up going west and doing pretty well, I think.
Grant was now the Union's most successful general, and in March 1864, Lincoln called him to Washington. He promoted Grant to command all Union armies with the rank of Lieutenant General, a rank that was last held by George Washington. Grant decided that the best...
And why did they give it to Grant? Well, they had to make him a lieutenant general so that he outranked all the other generals, because he was already a major general, but there were a lot of major generals, and your level of seniority was based on when you got the rank. And there were 2 different ranks, and I don't want to get into all of it. There's Major General Volunteers, Major General of the regular army. Volunteers, much like what happens in World War II, where you have a theater rank, right? But then you have a post-war rank, because when they contract the size of the army, they're not going to need as many higher-ranking officers. And so whatever your regular army rank is the rank you would have had once the war ended. Your volunteer rank was the rank you had temporarily while the fighting was still going on. So Grant had to be made a 3-star so that he outranked all of the major generals that otherwise might have had seniority over him.
The way to win the war was to overwhelm the Confederacy militarily. The rebels had grown skilled at managing the limited resources they had available, shifting troops from one theater to another as needed. Grant proposed 5 simultaneous attacks on all parts of the Confederacy, which would prevent the various Confederate forces from reinforcing each other.
And it's ridiculous to me that the Union hadn't done this sooner, but part of it is because of the disjointed nature of the command. They didn't have one guy who was given the power and authority to do whatever he had to do and could make that decision. But Grant understood it had to happen all at once. You had to push on all fronts so that they couldn't defend everywhere at the same time. You can't have Robert E. Lee sending Longstreet west with a corps because he's got to hold them there in the east.
Of these, 2 were especially crucial. In the West, William T. Sherman, Grant's friend and trusted subordinate who had succeeded Grant as commander of the Western Theater, would invade Georgia and capture the important city of Atlanta. But all eyes were on the Eastern Theater, where the Army of the Potomac, commanded by George Meade but overseen by Grant, would take on Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
And people forget this. Meade was never removed as Army of the Potomac commander. Once he took command of the Army of the Potomac just a couple of days before the Battle of Gettysburg, he commanded that army for the rest of the war. But there were other armies as well. There's an army that's, or like an independent corps under General Burnside, which would have been attached to the Army of the Potomac, but Burnside actually outranked Meade, so he couldn't serve under Meade because of the date of the rank and things like that. One of the little things that Grant had to deal with. But Grant went with Meade's army, but Meade did still have command of that army.
For the last 2 years, Lee had made fools out of one Union commander after another. He had consistently outflanked and outfought the Army of the Potomac to the point that his name was spoken with reverence in the South and with fear in the North. The stories about him took on an almost mythical quality. Some said he couldn't be defeated in battle and that he was divinely inspired. Grant, however, wasn't impressed. He crossed the Rapidan River and first encountered Lee at the Battle of the Wilderness on May the 5th. As with most battles of the Civil War, casualties were appalling, but rather than retreat, as his predecessors had done after a major battle, Grant attempted to move around Lee's left flank, trying to cut his army off from Richmond, the Confederate capital, and the Army's base of supply.
There was this fascinating moment where Grant's pulling the army out of the wilderness, and they get to this place where they're going to turn one way to go north, which is what had always happened after the army had been beaten, or they're going to turn the other way and head south. And when they realize that they're heading south, they start cheering, and that is the turning point for the mental part of this fight, right? This is when the men realize, okay, we're in this to win this. We're not backing down. And I think that gives a morale boost to the Union that helps them to start overcoming.
What followed was a series of bloody battles called the Overland Campaign. Grant systematically worked his way deeper into Virginia, engaging Lee all the way. Grant suffered 55,000 casualties to Lee's 35,000, but Lee could hardly afford to replace the many lost, while Grant had seemingly infinite reinforcements at his disposal. After almost 2 months of continuous fighting, Grant had Lee's army penned up outside the crucial rail hub of Petersburg, not far from Richmond. Grant dug trenches and settled in for a siege. He knew that he had Lee where he wanted him. It was just a matter of time. But time wasn't something that Grant and the Union Army had. 1864 was a presidential election year, and with the war bogged down and the slaughter growing worse every day, there seemed a real chance that Abraham Lincoln would lose his bid for re-election.
And you know, I mean, we've been doing all this talk about Lincoln the tyrant in videos recently. Nothing really says tyranny like standing for re-election in the middle of a war, right? If he was such a tyrant, he would have probably found a way to suspend the election until after the Civil War was over, but he didn't do that. He understood that the people needed to have their say, and they did.
His opponent, George McClellan, was angry that Lincoln had forced him out of the army and pledged that if elected, he would end the war by any means necessary, including signing a peace deal with the Confederates that allowed them to keep their separate country.
I don't know that McClellan pledged that. I'd be curious to know what his source is for that. I know that's the Democratic Party's policy. That was their official stance as a party, was a negotiated peace. I think McClellan pretty vocally said that he was willing to continue the war. And I think, honestly, if McClellan had won the election, I think the Union still wins the war. Maybe the peace looks different, but they still win the war, because by the time McClellan would have taken office in March of 65, the war was over.
It would also condemn the millions of slaves freed by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to a return to bondage.
Possible.
Grant was being called a butcher in the northern press because of the high casualties the army had suffered in the Overland Campaign, particularly in battles such as Cold Harbor, when the Union suffered 13,000 casualties to the Confederacy's 5,000. The bottom line was that the Union needed to make real progress in the war before the election in November, or everything they had fought for might come to nothing.
Yeah.
Salvation came in the form of General Sherman. After a bloody campaign and siege of his own, Sherman captured the city of Atlanta in September. As the Confederates left the city, they attempted to burn military supplies, but the fire spread out of control and burned much of the city to the ground.
Did you hear that? Who started the fire? The Confederates did. Who started the fire? Not Sherman. Sherman did not burn Atlanta to the ground. Now, did he try to stop it? Now, did he march on Savannah and have the March to the Sea? Absolutely. But Sherman gets way too much credit for burning Atlanta, which, by the way, was not even the largest city in Georgia at the time. It was an important rail hub, I think, but it was not one of the largest cities.
This victory, extensively covered by jubilant northern newspapers, practically guaranteed Lincoln's re-election. Sherman then marched on the city of Savannah, destroying everything in his path, an early example of modern total war, tearing the guts out of the Confederacy as he marched his army to the sea and then northwards through the Carolinas. Meanwhile, back in Petersburg, Grant and Lee's armies had dug miles of trenches in a scene that served as a prelude to the Western Front of World War I 50 years later. Grant patiently extended his lines, stretching Lee's army thinner and thinner until by the end of March it was a breaking point.
So, and it's important to note that Petersburg, which is what we remember for the siege lines and the trenches, is not the first place this happens. It was happening at Vicksburg, there's siege lines. There's mines being dug at Vicksburg. There's assaults on strong fortifications. And also, one of the reasons why Grant suffers such high casualties in the Overland Campaign is that Lee was doing the same thing. At Spotsylvania, he was dug in. Strong fortifications. Cold Harbor, you've got trenches happening. This is the nature of warfare in the Civil War by 1864 in the Eastern Theater.
On April the 2nd, Grant ordered an assault that captured Petersburg and forced Lee to abandon Richmond, which was captured the very next day. Grant chased Lee for another week before Lee realized the game was up. At Appomattox, on April the 9th, Lee surrendered to Grant. For all intents and purposes, the Civil War was over. On April the 14th, 5 days after the surrender of Lee, Grant and his wife were supposed to accompany the Lincolns to Ford's Theatre in the evening, but ultimately declined the invitation in favor of spending time with his children. The Grants were
And part of the reason why is Mrs. Grant was not a big fan of Mrs. Lincoln. Not unlike some other generals' wives. They didn't really care for her. She was dealing with some pretty severe mental illness, and that was starting to show more and more. And it only got way worse after her husband died. But there's this fascinating incident that happens where the Grants are leaving D.C. and they're riding in a carriage, and a guy rides up on his horse and looks inside the carriage and then rides away after staring at them. And Mrs. Grant was convinced for the rest of her life that that was John Wilkes Booth who had done that.
In Philadelphia that night when he received word that Lincoln had been shot by an assassin. For the rest of his life, he would feel guilty that he wasn't there to protect his president, who he called the greatest man I have ever known. Most historians agree, however, that if Grant had been with Lincoln that night, it's likely Grant would have been killed too, as the commanding general was targeted by Booth's group, and he disliked carrying weapons anyway.
And remember, Booth, this was a conspiracy that was meant to take out the entire head of the federal government. They were supposed to also take out Andrew Johnson. They were supposed to take out Secretary of State Seward. And the Seward attack happened. The guy who was supposed to attack Johnson completely chickened out, but Seward survived.
Grant, as commanding general of the army, was now responsible for overseeing the military occupation of the South during Reconstruction. He found in Andrew Johnson a much more difficult president to deal with than Lincoln. Johnson wanted to end Reconstruction as quickly as possible, even if that meant undoing the gains made by African Americans after the abolition of slavery.
Grant goes out of his way in his autobiography to try and speak well of pretty much everybody. Even when he says something negative, he tries to temper it as best he can, but it's pretty clear, not only from studying Grant's life, but also from Grant's own words, that there's no love lost between him and Johnson.
Johnson fought with Congress and with his own cabinet and was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868, coming very close to being removed from office. Grant, meanwhile, was a national hero and a darling of the Republican Party. In 1868, he was nominated by the Republicans for president, an office he hadn't sought but wasn't going to turn down either.
Yeah, and Grant, this is not technically his first kind of political role. He actually serves temporarily as acting Secretary of War under Johnson while they're dealing with all the cabinet issues, and he has to step into that role.
He won in a landslide, and he took office in March 1869. Like many generals who go on to become politicians, Grant found the qualities that benefited him in the army were detrimental to him in the political arena. The military is an autocracy. The generals give orders and the soldiers obey. But in politics, leaders must be masters of persuasion, and in the aftermath of the war, opinions could not have been more divided. Reconstruction would dominate Grant's time as president. Grant was determined to continue the Republican policy of Reconstruction, which included continuing occupation of the South by federal troops, promoting organizations for newly freed slaves like the Freedmen's Bureau, and overall attempting to dismantle the antebellum power structure in the South that had promoted the idea of Southern nationalism.
And Grant's probably one of the best presidents when it comes to civil rights that the country has ever had. And he found himself increasingly his hands tied by political just by the direction of the mood of the country toward Reconstruction as time went on into his second term. But I still feel like he did a lot more than he gets credit for.
But he faced opposition from a variety of sources. In the South, ex-Confederate soldiers formed secret groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, to terrify African Americans and whites who helped them or supported the Republicans with threats of violence that often turned bloody.
I never did the final part of it, and I probably should do that at some point, but I've done a couple of videos, original content on Reconstruction, a vastly understudied part of American history, and really probably one of the darkest chapters of our history. What happened to the freedmen after the war is a horrible, horrible, horrible stain on this country. Absolutely just brutal, the way these men, women, and children were treated.
Seeing in the Klan the possibility of renewed fighting in the South, Grant was determined to stop them. He established the Department of Justice as a federal cabinet department and charged his attorney general with prosecuting the Klan. Congress passed the Third Enforcement Act in 1871, which gave the president broad powers in combating the white supremacist groups in the South. By the end of Grant's first term, the Klan had been effectively destroyed and wouldn't be seen again in America for almost 50 years. In order to accomplish his political ends, Grant was forced to ally himself with politicians like Simon Cameron and Roscoe Conklin, senators who were more interested in how they could personally benefit from the machinations of office than actually helping people. These politicians, known as spoilsmen or stalwarts, built an elaborate system of patronage that filled the ranks of federal government jobs with political favorites. The system was wildly corrupt, filled with countless tales of bribery and graft. Grant's alliance with the stalwarts caused a faction of the Republican Party, the Liberal Republicans, to break with the rest of the party, as they believed Grant's entire administration was corrupt and they wanted reform.
This is an important thing to point out when he talks about liberal Republicans, is that for most of our nation's history, and I don't want to get too far into a tangent on this, but for most of our nation's history, the two-party system has operated in such a way in that within each of those parties, whatever those parties are, and we've gone through what is called party systems, like there's the first party system, second party system, where the nature of the parties, even the names sometimes change. But within those parties, there have always existed multiple wings. For example, with the Republicans, you had more mainstream, kind of leaning more conservative Republicans, and then you had what were known as the radical Republicans, which would be the liberals. These are the ones who want radical reforms, who want, citizenship for the freed slaves, and who are abolitionists and things like that. These are the people that had to be dealt with by the more mainstream Republicans, like Lincoln, like Grant. And so the Democrats had the same thing. The Democrats had multiple wings. It's only in really more modern times that we've seen the polarization of the parties to where the Democrats are very much kind of the liberal party and the Republicans are very much the conservative party. Even a generation or two ago, there were liberals and conservatives within each party.
Further, they opposed Grant's Reconstruction policies and wanted the troops out of the South. They joined with the Democrats, who weren't so interested in reform, but did oppose Reconstruction. Nonetheless, Grant was easily re-elected in 1872. A lot of things went wrong all at once for Grant during his second term. The economy collapsed very suddenly in 1873 as railroad stock suddenly plummeted and investors panicked.
And the subsequent time period, I think for most of the next several decades, is known as the Great Depression. I don't mean it lasted several decades. I mean that time, the depression that ensues after that panic is known as the Great Depression until the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Administration was beset by scandal. Grant was not personally corrupt, but he had a bad habit of trusting his associates, especially former military colleagues who were. Corruption was eventually found in 7 federal departments. Things came to a head in 1875 when the so-called whiskey ring was exposed. Whiskey distillers had been working with treasury agents to cheat the federal government out of distillation taxes and splitting the proceeds. A string of government officers were indicted in the investigation, including Orville Babcock, the president's private secretary. The scandals caused Grant's administration to lose most of its credibility, and combined with the economic depression and growing frustration over Reconstruction, it led to a government crisis as the 1876 election approached. Grant initially explored the idea of running for a third term as president, but ever since George Washington, an unofficial tradition of a president not serving more than 2 terms was considered almost sacrosanct in Washington, and Grant had few supporters within the Republican Party or Congress. He eventually decided against running again in 1876. The election was shrouded in controversy and was only settled after a backroom compromise gave Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in return for the withdrawal of troops from the South. The nation had now abandoned Reconstruction completely, and the
nation had been heading that way for a while. As I've mentioned in other videos, Grant found it more difficult all the time to enforce the policies he wanted to for Reconstruction because public opinion was turning so much against it.
The old Confederate states quickly established laws that made African Americans second-class citizens, the so-called Jim Crow South, that would last for almost 100 years. Because of the collapse of Reconstruction and the numerous scandals, many historians view Grant's presidency as a failure, but he did achieve a number of achievements during his 8 years in office. He established the nation's first national park, Yellowstone. He founded the Civil Service Commission in an attempt to combat the spoil system so prevalent during his administration, which laid the foundation of the modern professional government. He advocated for the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited states from denying people the right to vote based on race. And he was a strong supporter of civil rights, especially for blacks, Jews, and women.
And people will point to his relationship with Jews. There was a situation during the Civil War where he issued an order expelling Jews from his department, and that was definitely a stain on him, and that was something that he expressed a regret over for the rest of his life. So he wasn't perfect, but honestly, and I say this all the time, I think if we're going to talk about the character of men who have held the office of president, Grant's got to be right at the top of that list when we talk about men of good character. And honestly, if you were to put me on the spot and ask me, of all the men who have served as president of the United States, which one would you most want to have as a friend? It's this guy.
After leaving office, Grant and Julia embarked on a world tour, meeting many world leaders, including Queen Victoria, Otto von Bismarck, and Emperor Meiji of Japan. After 2.5 years, the Grants arrived back in the United States in 1879. Grant's old political allies tried to secure him the Republican nomination for a third term as president in 1880, but were unsuccessful, and the Grants moved to New York City and invested in a brokerage firm. But his business partner, Ferdinand Ward, was a swindler who ran the firm as a Ponzi scheme and attempted to run off with the money when it collapsed.
Total Ponzi scheme, and just so terrible what happens. And all of this kind of falls apart right at about the time that Grant finds out he's got terminal cancer.
Grant was left penniless. In 1884, Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer, probably caused by his near-constant cigar smoking. The illness was terminal, and he worried about leaving Julia without any money to live on after he died.
He described drinking a glass of water like pouring molten lava down his throat. And that's, we're talking months and months before he died that he did that. And he had been approached multiple times about writing his story down, and he didn't think of himself as a very good writer, and so he resisted it. But when he's penniless and he realizes that he's about to die and he's going to leave his wife, and several of his sons who were grown by this point had also invested in Ward's schemes and lost a lot of money. And so he's thinking about what he can do. And honestly, one of the most heroic things Grant ever does is get those memoirs done just days before he dies.
Grant's friend Mark Twain encouraged him to write his memoirs, offering him a deal that would pay 70% of the royalties from sales of the book, an unheard of amount at the time. He worked tirelessly on the book for months, despite failing health and extreme pain. He finished the manuscript in July of 1885, and only a few days later, on July the 23rd, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died at the age of 63. His funeral in New York City drew an estimated 1.5 million people, including many veterans of the war on both sides. He was buried in a temporary tomb in Riverside Park, and 12 years later, a permanent memorial, Grant's tomb, was finished and his remains were moved there, joined by Julia in 1902. She had lived the rest of her life on the proceeds from her husband's memoirs, about $450,000, almost $13 million in today's money. At the time of his death, Grant was considered one of America's foremost heroes, ranking up there with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So, what happened to Grant's reputation, since he obviously doesn't rank that highly now? In the decades that followed Grant's death, the historical analysis of the Civil War and Reconstruction began to be increasingly dominated by pro-Southern writers.
Wait, I thought history was written by the victors.
Historians, most belonging to the so-called Dunning School after Columbia University professor William Dunning, took the view that Southern secession wasn't driven by slavery, but by states' rights and the aggression of the North. Their story cast Robert E. Lee as the hero, who humbly defended the honor and property of his home against invaders. And because every hero needs a villain, they put Grant in that role. They revived charges by contemporary newspapers that Grant was a drunken general who threw away the lives of his men and only defeated Lee thanks to brute force.
And if you don't think that people believe that, just watch the comment section of this video. Look at the comment section of my short about Grant being promoted a couple of months ago. It's all over.
Southern whites developed the Dunning School of Thought into the lost cause philosophy that saw the Confederacy as a noble cause and made Southern generals into heroes and their Northern counterparts into villains. They used the lost cause philosophy throughout the first half of the 20th century to justify the continuation of discrimination towards African Americans. Grant was an unwilling victim of this, and it wasn't until the Jim Crow laws began to be torn down in the 1960s that his reputation underwent re-evaluation from modern historians. Today, after the publication of a number of biographies from more objective writers, Grant is viewed in a more favorable light by many Americans than he was 60 or 70 years ago. Ulysses S. Grant is, without a doubt, one of the most important figures in American history. He perhaps did more to win the war for the Union than any man, except for Abraham Lincoln, keeping the country from being split into two and abolishing slavery. His military tactics are still studied today in military academies worldwide, and his presidency, while not as successful as his army career, still accomplished a number of important achievements. When you consider where he started with where he ended up, it is a truly remarkable rise, and the United States is better off for his service.
Absolutely, and it's a crime that there hasn't been a major movie about the man, or at least a really good miniseries, because his story is absolutely incredible and is worth a good Hollywood treatment, like something good that really sticks to the history and doesn't try to use it to tell us, to push a narrative or something. But so put the links up to some other videos to check out, to follow up with, and highly recommend you check out Chernow's biography of Grant and then Grant's autobiography if you want further reading about the man to really learn the details of some of what we talked about. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to revisit one of our favorite channels, Biographics. There you can see Simon on the screen with his epic beard and all. And today we're going to visit a topic that I'm pretty familiar with for a couple of reasons. One is because it's about a U.S. president who was a Civil War veteran, and those are two of the areas that I spend a lot of time studying is presidential history and Civil War history. He also happens to be our local president where I live. And I've got some family ties to the house he was born in. 3 of my 4 grandparents went to Niles McKinley High School. My wife went to Niles McKinley High School. So it's definitely a guy I'm very familiar with, and that anybody who lives where I live is very familiar with because he is our local president. I grew up 5 minutes from where he did. So today we're going to take a look at William McKinley, Building the American Century. As always, the link is in the description to the original content. Let's dive in. I want to give a big thank you to Prof. Moff and also to Brandon from Indian Trail, North Carolina, who are 2 of our executive producer level patrons. Thank you guys for your support.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. At the moment of his death, it's likely that William McKinley assumed his name would live forever. As the 25th President of the United States, McKinley had helped steer his nation out of its worst economic slump prior to the Great Depression. He'd overseen a victorious war against...
In fact, for a while, that time, like 1870s to the 1890s, was a pretty bad economic time. There was a specific economic crash in the 1870s. There's another one around 1890s. But this time was referred to as the Great Depression until the Great Depression.
European power, shepherded through the annexation of Hawaii, the purchase of the Philippines, and supervised the creation of an American empire. At home, too, he was popular, the first president to win consecutive second term in a quarter of a century. So, when he was gunned down by a terrorist in 1908...
And what he means by that is the first president to win a consecutive second term going back to Grant. Grant was the last one to do it before him. He was elected in 1868 and 1872. There had not been... Today, back-to-back terms is kind of the norm, right? You go back, Clinton had 2 terms, Bush had 2 terms, Obama had 2 terms, Trump only had 1. That's actually out of the ordinary lately. But you had Lincoln, who was elected to 2 terms but assassinated before he could serve the second. Grant elected to 2 terms. Cleveland elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. But otherwise, in a stretch of about 70 years there, you got a lot of one-term presidents.
It must have seemed as if future generations would revere him alongside Abraham Lincoln. But of course, that's not what happened. Today, William McKinley is largely forgotten by the general public, known merely for being the guy whose death propelled VP Teddy Roosevelt to the White House, if he's remembered at all. So how did this happen? How did a man whose presidency seemed to usher in a new epoch slide so gently into oblivion? Today, Biographics is telling the story of William McKinley, the forgotten architect of the American century.
That's really true, and I'm sure they're going to get into some of this, but think about the consequential time in which McKinley is president. It's the American Empire, it's the Philippines and the Spanish-American War, and it's Hawaii, and it's building the Navy to project that power at a time when other countries were doing the same thing. Look how young he was there.
Given how anonymous he is today, it's fitting that William McKinley's early life was so marvelously obscure. Born on January the 29th, 1843 in the small town of Niles, Ohio,
I actually have this map. It's from the 1880s. I have it in this room somewhere here. This is really cool because you can really see what Niles looked like at this time. My grandparents grew up on Langley Street, which is right here. This area right here eventually will become known as Niles Fire Brick Company. And today Niles has a huge population of people with Kentucky roots, and that's because of Niles Fire Brick. They recruited hundreds of workers from the town of Olive Hill, Kentucky, this little town in eastern Kentucky, to come up and work at Niles Fire Brick. And so to this day, there are more people in Niles from Olive Hill than live in Olive Hill, Kentucky. But McKinley grows up right here on what is now Main Street. His house that he was born in is like right here. In fact, I want to show you a little bit of Niles because they actually just rebuilt his birthplace. All right, so a little bit of a geography lesson about me in particular. I grew up right on this street, Route 46 in Mineral Ridge, this little town right there. I live in Austin Town now, which is right there. And then here's Niles right here. So that image that we're looking at in the video is actually looking from kind of the southwest toward Niles. But right here is Main Street going across the Mahoning River. The Mahoning River is kind of the reason that Youngstown and Niles and other industrial centers kind of sprouted up in this part of Ohio because of access to the Mahoning River, which eventually makes its way down into, I think, the Beaver River, which then eventually makes its way into the Ohio River, which goes into the Mississippi. But anyway, zooming in here, this is Main Street. And then McKinley's home that he was born in is right here. It was built by the brother of my 5th great grandfather. But I want to show you kind of the ground level and tell you a little bit of how this house kind of came about, because it wasn't here until about 10, 15 years ago. There was a bank right here with a drive-through that had been built on the site. The original house that McKinley was born in got moved at some point in the 19th century to a park. And then it got moved again, I think, and then it burned down in a fire. So it was lost. So when the opportunity presented itself 10, 15 years ago, they tore down that old bank right there and rebuilt from what we know of how McKinley's house looked like. They rebuilt it here, and you can actually go in and do tours and things like that on the actual site where it was. Now, I grew up a lot going to the McKinley Library, which is right here, that was built in the aftermath of his assassination. Pretty close to the site where he was born, but not exactly on the site where he was born. And pre-internet times, this was our local library for me growing up.
William grew up the seventh of 8 children, doing all the things that boys did for fun in the mid-19th century: swimming, hunting, and learning to ride a horse.
And I should say, too, that there are members of the McKinley family, including, I believe, a young sister of President McKinley, who are still buried in Niles. It's just off. You can't see it on this particular image, but if you went up Vienna right here, you would come to what is known today as the Niles City Cemetery. And the oldest section of that cemetery, I have dozens and dozens of family members in that cemetery, but the oldest section of that cemetery is where some of the McKinley family is buried.
Boys did for fun in the mid-19th century: swimming, hunting, and learning to ride a horse. His parents, too, were utterly ordinary. His mother a devout Christian, while his father ran a small foundry. It wasn't enough to make them rich, but it was enough to make them live without worry. Average as they were, though, there were 2 things that marked out the boys' parents as unusual. One was a ferocious belief in the value of education. Although they were happy in Niles, Mr. and Mrs. McKinley hated the idea of their kids growing up semi-educated ignoramuses. When William was just 10, they moved to the town of Poland just so that he could attend private school. But it was...
So they moved to Poland, but it's important to note, not the country Poland, okay? Let me show you again. We'll go to the map. So backing out here a little bit now, you see Niles right here, and you follow the Mahoning River down from Niles, and you get into Youngstown, and just on the other side of Youngstown is Poland Township. My kids play them in sports, play Poland. When what's known as the Connecticut Western Reserve was laid out, before Ohio existed, this whole part of Northeast Ohio was known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. And so a lot of Connecticut names here. I grew up in Trumbull County, which is named after Governor Trumbull of Connecticut. I grew up in Wethersfield Township, which is where Niles is. It's in Wethersfield Township, again, named after a Connecticut area. But they were laid out in ranges and townships, and they're all equal size. And Town 1, Range 1 was Poland Township, all the way down in the corner. So, right here.
The second notable thing about his family that would have the biggest impact. Both Mum and Pop were ardent abolitionists. This was a time when many in the North campaigned against slavery's expansion, but stopped short of wanting to outlaw it in the South. The McKinleys, by contrast, drilled into their children that slavery was evil, that it was worth putting your life on the line to help eradicate it.
And it's important to highlight that because a lot of times we try to give people who were white supremacists by today's standards, or people who were pro-slavery, a pass because we say, well, that's how most people felt at the time. But the fact is, there were a lot of ardent abolitionists like the McKinley family, like the Grant family, who believed, even in a time when most people didn't, in the idea of freedom for 4 million slaves.
Those beliefs would soon have a profound effect on young William's future. In 1860, a combination of illness and financial troubles forced 16-year-old McKinley to leave his college and return home, taking up work as a postal clerk to make ends meet.
And where he was going to college was Allegheny College, which is just across the border up in, I think, Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is maybe an hour and a half away from here, driving. So yeah, he didn't quite finish his education then and enlists, I think, as a private in the Civil War.
Barely had he settled into this role when news reached Ohio that a South Carolina militia had bombarded Fort Sumter, kick-starting the Civil War. Within weeks, McKinley had signed up, joining the Ohio 23rd Regiment, determined to do his duty, a duty that he'd carry out with jaw-dropping zeal. As a private,
and the 23rd Ohio was eventually commanded by Rutherford B. Hayes, 2 presidents in a single regiment. Pretty cool stuff.
But McKinley was almost suicidally brave, gaining a reputation for riding through dense cannon fire to deliver urgent messages. He served at Antietam, still regarded as the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, where he charged through heavy enemy fire to deliver supplies to Union troops.
Specifically, he was the commissary sergeant. He was getting food to these troops. And there's a huge monument. In fact, I did a video about it. I'll throw up a link at the end. At the Antietam battlefield, a huge monument that was placed to McKinley, to a guy known as Coffee Bill, because he would bring coffee to the soldiers. But he gets a commission after that.
It was antics like these that brought him to the attention of his commander, Rutherford B. Hayes. 20 years older than McKinley, Hayes regarded all his men as family, treating them with a respect that was legendary. But he seemed to have a special affection for the young man from Niles. After Antietam, he placed McKinley on his general staff. By the time the war was over, he seemed to consider the lad an honorary son. For his part, McKinley returned home with the rank of brevet major. For the rest of his life, those closest to him would refer to him affectionately as the Major. Yet while he might have returned to civilian life, McKinley wouldn't go back to his pre-war job. Back in Ohio, the young man opens a law practice in Canton, becoming locally successful.
And Canton, there's a Canton McKinley High School also, because he would spend most of his adult life in Canton. It's where he's elected governor from. It's where he's elected to Congress from. It's where he's elected as president from. And that's where he's buried today.
The real change would come courtesy of his new mentor. In 1867, Rutherford Hayes came to McKinley and basically said, "Young man, I've decided to run for governor. Fancy doing my dirty work?" Stumping for Hayes that year was McKinley's first brush with politics, and evidently he liked what he saw.
This was a time in history when most people didn't campaign for themselves. It was kind of seen as beneath the candidate to do that, and so a lot of times they do like these front porch campaigns where they'd kind of do stuff from home, but they didn't travel around and campaign. They had people do that for them. McKinley does that for Hayes. Mark Hanna will do that for McKinley.
After Hayes won, the younger man threw himself into Republican politics. In 1869, he was elected prosecuting attorney of Stark County, and while that might seem like a minor post to start with, it really was just the start. Now he'd gotten a taste of it, McKinley wouldn't be content to just sit around with his thumb up his bottom in Stark County. Oh no. Instead, he was going to take that butt and that soiled thumb all the way to Washington. Since no one actually asked him, we can't say for certain, but it seems likely that McKinley would have regarded 1869 as the greatest year of his life. That's because 1869 wasn't just the year he moved into politics, but also the year he met Ida Saxton. Highly educated and extremely progressive on rights for women and African Americans, Ida was everything McKinley dreamed of in a partner. The pair met at a picnic that summer. By January 1871, they'd married. Just 11 months later, on Christmas Day, their daughter Catherine was born. Not long after.
And unfortunately, it's one of the sad aspects of McKinley's story is that not only did none of his children survive to adulthood, but his wife was really, really frail and dealt with some severe health issues for most of their married life.
After, in 1873, their second daughter followed. But if 1869 was the highlight of McKinley's life, 1873 would represent the blackest depths. Just 4 months after being born, their youngest daughter died. Around the same time, Ida's mother passed away, and the combined tragedy seems to have broken her. For the rest of her life, Ida would be crippled with depression that only got worse when their daughter Catherine likewise died in 1875. Combined with a sudden onset of epilepsy, the mental breakdown helped turn her into an invalid, someone in need of long-term care. And
this says a lot about McKinley, that he managed to balance being in the highest levels of government, an influential congressman, an Ohio governor and president, but also seemed to have really given a lot of attention to caring for his wife.
And care for her, William McKinley would. Throughout the rest of his story, even as his star rises, even as he becomes president, McKinley's number one concern will always be Ida. For some members of the public, this was scandalous. For others, admirable. But it's unlikely the future president gave a damn either way. For 4 short years, he and Ida enjoyed a perfect life. In return, he would now stand by her until the bitter end. Not that his extra duties as carer would get in the way of McKinley's rise. The same year his mentor, Rutherford Hayes, decided to run for the White House, McKinley ran for his own seat in Congress. So loyal was he to the older man, though, that he took time off from his own campaign to stump for him. Evidently, it didn't do any harm. That November.
And as I mentioned earlier about the fact that people didn't typically campaign for themselves at this time, it was a great way to get your own name out to run on behalf of other people, right? So campaigning for Hayes puts McKinley at the forefront and gets him his own positions in government. And then the same thing will happen with Mark Hanna when Mark Hanna, who's also a Northeast Ohio guy, is from Lisbon, when Mark Hanna campaigns for McKinley and then gets his own seat in the Ohio Senate.
McKinley won a seat in the House of Representatives.
I should say a U.S. senator from Ohio.
would hold, bar a brief period following the 1882 election, for 14 years. In a whimsical little twist, McKinley celebrated his win by sticking a scarlet carnation in his lapel, a fashion choice that he kept up for the rest of his career. It would be thanks to this that Ohio adopted the carnation as its state flower in 1904. But while
And scarlet and gray are the colors of Ohio State.
McKinley had deftly won his congressional run, the same couldn't be said for Hayes. The 1876 election was the tightest in history, with just a handful of contested electoral votes separating Hayes from his Democratic opponents. After a bitter political fight, the Democrats agreed to drop their claim to those all-important votes in return for President Hayes ending Reconstruction. For a supporter of African-American rights, this was likely a nasty blow to McKinley. Not that he was brave enough to show it, though.
Now, and I've said this before, I think this whole thing about the corrupt agreement that Hayes makes to get the White House over Samuel Tilden is a little bit overblown, because the political winds had shifted sharply against Reconstruction by 1876. Reconstruction did not look in 1876 the way it did in, say, 1870. A lot of the power behind it had already dissipated. And if Tilden had been elected as a Democrat to the White House, he also was going to end Reconstruction. Reconstruction was done either way. And that's unfortunate because of what it led to for 100 years or more in the South for African Americans. But the fact is, it really didn't change all that much.
Throughout his time in Washington, McKinley would remain on Hayes' good side, and in return, the president would help propel his career ever higher. By 1889, that included reaching the heights of chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, from where McKinley was able to pursue his pet project, tariffs.
Ways and Means Committee, one of the most powerful positions you can have in the government at that time, and even to this day in the House.
Era, the Republican Party was broadly against free trade, preferring instead a form of protectionism to help boost American manufacturers. McKinley was all in on this, believing aggressive trade policies would help improve the lives of ordinary people. So much so that in 1890 he used his position to push through something known as the McKinley Tariff. Slapping import taxes on over 1,500 goods, McKinley confidently expected the act to raise prosperity for manufacturers, which it absolutely did. Unfortunately, it also sent consumer prices skyrocketing. The hike on goods was so eye-watering that it effectively dynamited the Congressional Republican Party. By the 1890 midterms, voters were so angry that the GOP lost 93 seats and control of the House.
And the Republicans had dominated politics since Lincoln's election in 1860, with a few minor exceptions in there. For the most part, they dominated for a good 60 years. And this is also a shift in the Republican Party to where, even to this day, a lot of people identify the Republicans with big business and the wealthy and things like that. And this is really where that starts, is with McKinley.
Among those swept out of office was William McKinley. Stung, hurt, McKinley slunk back to Ohio to run for governor. Although he won, it was hardly a resounding success. McKinley's margin of victory was barely a polling error. But politics is a winner-takes-all game, and whether voters were enthusiastic for him or not, McKinley was now the governor of the Buckeye State. It would be in this new role that he'd soon meet the man who'd make him president.
Mark Hanna.
Mark Hanna occupies a strange, shifting place in McKinley's story. In the early 20th century, the wealthy Ohioan was often cast in the role of puppet master, the guy who made McKinley president to push his own pet policies. Today, though, a more common view has it that McKinley used Hanna more than Hanna used him, leveraging his patron's wealth to pursue independent goals. Whatever the truth, there's no doubt their meeting while McKinley was governor set both men on the path back to Washington, but only after fate gave a little bit of a helping hand. In 1893, the same year that Rutherford Hayes went off to the Great Ohio in the Sky, Democrat Grover Cleveland began his second non-consecutive...
The Great Ohio in the Sky. That might be one of the coolest things I've ever heard. Going off to the Great Ohio in the Sky. Very cool.
Term in the White House. Unfortunately for his party, no sooner had he started than America was walloped by one of the worst depressions in history. The Panic of 1893 collapsed the economy. Unemployment jumped to 19%. Scores of banks and railroads failed. Savings were wiped out. Investors lost everything. Among those nearly destroyed was McKinley, who'd foolishly co-signed a $100,000 bank loan for a friend. When the friend went bust, McKinley was left on the hook for the money. Luckily, the uber-wealthy Mark Hanna stepped in to bail him out, and that left McKinley perfectly poised to reap the Depression's bitter rewards. With the economy in freefall, the electorate gave the Democrats a shellacking.
It's the economy, stupid. That was a saying in the 1990s during one of the elections. And, the economy is always, whether it's controlled by the president or not, the guy at the top is going to get the blame and get the credit, depending on how the economy goes.
94 midterms remained the worst defeat of any party in an off-presidential election year. What the Republicans had suffered in 1890, the Democrats were now suffering 10 times over, and that meant 1896 was now looking like an assured GOP victory. All McKinley had to do was make sure that his name was on the ticket. By now,
if anybody, if you're not familiar with that term GOP, which is used for the Republicans, it means Grand Old Party. It was just a nickname they had.
McKinley was a known quantity, having chaired the Republican National Convention and governed Ohio for years. But rather than take his chances, he was determined to make sure he was the delegate's only choice. Backed by Hanna's money and spin operation, McKinley ran perhaps the first recognizably modern nomination campaign in history, one marked by some interesting firsts. Perhaps the biggest was his decision to speak to 2 all-black audiences while campaigning, the first white candidate to ever do so. Yet, it would be in the presidential campaign itself that McKinley really redefined what American politics could be. Given the nomination that summer with Garrett Hobart as his VP pick, McKinley launched what was then the largest election campaign the nation had ever seen. Backed by a war chest of $4 million, the Republican Party flooded swing states with political leaflets, mailings, pins, badges, you name it.
And a lot of this, I shouldn't say a lot of it, but there was a significant amount of money who came from some of those early, very wealthy men, the John D. Rockefellers of the world. Rockefeller's another Northeast Ohio guy. And they saw an opportunity to get behind McKinley and maybe get some influence there in the process.
Anything to keep their candidate's name in people's minds. McKinley himself, meanwhile, took the old-fashioned front porch campaign to a whole new level. In the months leading up to November, he invited a total of 750,000 people to hear him speak, and not just in any old order. Across 350 speeches, McKinley tailored his pitch to different groups. To the traditional Republican WASPs, but also to Jews, to Catholics, to black people, to emigres from Portugal, Bohemia, Germany, you name it. After decades in which the two parties had come to rely on their bases, McKinley was trying to build a big tent coalition, one that included as many traditional Democratic voters as possible. For their part, the Democrats put up the populist firebrand William Jennings Bryan, but while he had energy...
Who would be the Democratic nominee 3 times and who would lose 3 times. And the interesting thing about this particular election is that both of these men were deeply religious men. They actually had a lot in common in terms of their personal lives, both deeply religious Christians, but very different philosophy when it came to government.
Bryan was playing an old game, preaching to the choir, even as McKinley was luring them away to his exciting new chancel. That November, the results were unambiguous. McKinley beat Bryan by a margin of 600,000 in the popular vote and nearly 100 in the Electoral College. For those of us alive today, used to reading about Ronald Reagan's 1980 landslide or FDR crushing it in 1932, McKinley's victory might seem unspectacular, but make no mistake, in 1896 it was a political earthquake. For the first time since Ulysses S. Grant was re-elected a quarter century earlier, a candidate had won over 50% of the popular vote. The era of extremely narrow victories was over. McKinley...
Think about that. For the first time in a quarter century, a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. It actually did not happen all that often. And to this day, we still have... I mean, Lincoln got, 42%? Bill Clinton only got a little over 40% when he won. Not all elections are like a mandate, are a majority of people. Sometimes it's just a plurality. You got more votes than everybody else.
Had just won the most convincing mandate in a generation, and he would use that to completely upend politics. In one specific way, the election of William McKinley sparked the end of an era. Upon his inauguration, the 25th president became the 5th and last Civil War veteran to reach the highest office. Perhaps fitting.
So, Civil War veterans who were president, obviously Grant, Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes, William McKinley was one. And so was, let's see here, who are we missing in all of that? James Garfield. All Republicans, all from Ohio. Yeah, right. Hayes, Harrison, McKinley, Grant, all from Ohio, and Garfield. I believe, I mean, if we're talking about veterans, we're talking about men who actually served on the front lines, right? So guys like, who am I thinking of here? Guys like Grover Cleveland. I think he had some kind of a commission, but didn't actually serve, like, in combat.
His time in the White House would be dominated by conflict, but this time the fighting would be taking place on American soil, but in the last remaining outposts of the Spanish Empire. Back in 1895, when McKinley was still just governor of Ohio, the people of Cuba had risen in revolt against Madrid, to which Madrid had responded by herding 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps, an insane overreaction that had done for Spain's reputation what the Newsnight interview did for Prince Andrews. By the time McKinley became commander-in-chief, the American public and press were demanding some form of intervention.
What he just said there is so key. The public and the press. The press played a huge role in propelling the United States into war with Spain. So much so that it perpetuated some really fabricated untruths that became the basis for the war, mainly the explosion of the USS Maine.
At first, the new president kept things diplomatic. By gently applying pressure to Madrid, McKinley got the Spaniards to grudgingly release the camp prisoners and grant Cuba limited authority. This even led Washington sending the battleship Maine to Havana as a show of friendship. But then the 15th of February 1898 rolled around and everything went to hell. That day, a mysterious explosion destroyed the Maine in harbor, killing 226 crewmen. In the aftermath, a tsunami of anger washed over America. Before an investigation could be concluded, the press was whipping up further for war with Madrid. Not so long ago, historians believed that McKinley allowed this fervor to carry him along, dragging him into the war before he knew all of the facts, the Iraq War of the late 19th century. But newer scholarship disputes this version. In modern tellings, McKinley did all he humanly could to avoid war until it became necessary, desperately keeping diplomatic channels open until Spain angrily cut all contact. Whichever version is true, the outcome was absolutely the same.
So what probably happened with the Maine, what it was blamed on was a mine in the harbor, but it was actually probably an internal explosion that caused it.
3rd of April, Madrid declared war. 2 days later, Washington did the same, the first time America had declared war on a European power since 1812. Yet, while the War of 1812 would result in a messy draw, the Spanish-American War would have a much clearer outcome. By that, we mean the United States absolutely crushed Madrid. Within days, Spain's Pacific Fleet had been destroyed in the Philippines. Not long after, the Atlantic Fleet was sunk near Jamaica, and American troops were marching on Puerto Rico. Cuba itself, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt victoriously led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, with Santiago falling not long after. By the 12th of August, Spain had been defeated, and the war was over. A war in which McKinley had played a vital role, using newly installed telephones to talk to his generals in real time. Yet it wasn't the war itself that so shaped McKinley's presidency, but what came after. From the ashes of Spain's defeat, the 25th president helped build a true American empire. At the height of the fighting in July, McKinley had already signed an order officially annexing Hawaii.
So think about this for a second. Most of America's early history, the first 100 years or so, is defined by two things, right? Slavery and manifest destiny. This idea, manifest destiny, that the U.S. was destined to control everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny's been completed. The U.S. controls everything that the modern map shows today on the continent. So what's next? Well, now we're looking to the idea of colonies, right? Well, the European powers have gathered up most of those colonies already, so you're going to have to take them from them. So this war with Spain became an opportunity to get a base in Cuba, to solidify what was happening with Hawaii in 1898 being annexed, which gave us a Pacific base, and then eventually spreading over to the Philippines.
With Madrid defeated, he oversaw a peace treaty that expanded Washington's holdings further still. Under the terms thrashed out, Puerto Rico and Guam became American possessions, and Cuba was nominally granted independence, but in reality was likewise drawn into Washington's orbit. But the biggest change was the purchase of the Philippines. For $20 million, Madrid signed over its Great Pacific Outpost. With that purchase, the US became a true colonial power. McKinley personally pushed hard for this, convincing the Senate to ratify the treaty with a 2/3 majority,
And this was not the first time the U.S. had attempted to do this. Grant during his presidency, 1869 to 1877, had an agreement in place in which the U.S. was going to annex what was known as Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. But he couldn't get the Senate on board to ratify it, so it didn't happen.
Using the House to appropriate millions for empire building. It was a hugely divisive decision, one which saw guys like Mark Twain eviscerate the president for wanting to emulate the corrupt empires of Europe. But Twain was in the minority. Enthusiastically backed by Teddy Roosevelt, McKinley embraced America's new role in the world, a role that would make it one of the world's great powers, a role that would also involve some very murky moral compromises. Just as it's hard to make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, so too is it hard to build an empire without breaking a whole lot of humans. In the case of the American Empire, most of that breaking came during the Philippine-American War. Having been freed from Spanish rule, a lot of Filipinos believed, not unreasonably, that their islands should belong to them. So when Uncle Sam instead rolled up and started draping everything in star-spangled banners, they tried their best to fight back.
And remember, this is a time before the idea of self-determination and people being able to rule themselves is really taking hold, which it will in another generation after the First World War. This is a time when this is what great powers did. It doesn't excuse it, but the U.S. is not acting any different than a lot of other powers, but it does. It gets really, really ugly.
The result? McKinley sends in an American occupation force, one that met the rebels with brutal violence. By the time the war ended in 1902, it's estimated some 200,000 Filipinos had died. Many of the tactics that had so outraged Americans when used by Spain on Cuba were now turned on the Philippines with predictably awful results. Yet the Philippines wasn't McKinley's only post-war foreign adventure. In 1900, he committed troops without congressional approval to the Eight-Nation Alliance sent to put down China's Boxer Rebellion. It was a move that won the US a $25 million payout from China's post-invasion indemnity, while also confirming it as a nation newly willing to flex its muscle on the world stage. This is one of the reasons some call McKinley the architect of the American century.
Yeah, that's true. And, this is not the only time the U.S. does this. They're going to be involved in Haiti. In the years leading up to the First World War involvement. They're going to be involved in Mexico in those years. You look at some of the men who served in World War I, like in the Marines, and these were guys who had received medals of honor for actions in Mexico or in Haiti or in the Philippines.
Just because he helped guide the country out of the 1890s depression and into prosperity, but because he set the blueprints for Washington's foreign interventionist policy. This was a policy that would echo through World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. Still, we don't want to paint his presidency as one entirely predicated on foreign policy. Even with the conflagration that was engulfing the Philippines, McKinley was likewise changing things back home. Perhaps his most notable achievement was to concentrate power back in the hands of the president. Following the Civil War, the US had gone through an era when real power seemed to lie with Congress. Now McKinley embarked on a great centralizing drive, making the White House once again the first among co-equal branches, paving the way for the extremely active presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson that would follow.
Yeah, remember that Lincoln really kind of pushed forward a lot of executive power in order to win the American Civil War, and so there was a pushback on that by Congress in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, it's arguable that McKinley's most impactful domestic decision didn't involve, once again, raising tariffs or his laudable hiring of African Americans into diplomatic positions, but simply giving Roosevelt a job. Back in 1896, the younger man had campaigned heartily for McKinley, so much so that advisors wondered if the new president shouldn't reward him. Personally, McKinley didn't like the idea at all. He thought Roosevelt was too pugnacious, too unwilling to compromise. But he also recognized that Teddy had a sharp mind and was genuinely talented. So he decided to take a gamble on him, making him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That allowed Roosevelt to have a high-profile position to resign from when war broke out, allowed him to become a famous hero at the head of the Rough Riders, and return to Republican politics as one of the hottest properties. Yet this would still have been for naught, and McKinley not taken a second chance. On the 21st of November 1899, McKinley's original VP, Garrett Hobart, died in office. With no 25th Amendment, the position remained open until the 1900 Republican Convention, by which time Teddy was the favorite to join McKinley.
Yeah, so that's a great point, is that there is no... A lot of the things we take for granted today, things like the line of succession, those are much more modern developments, right? So when John Tyler becomes president on the death of the president, all the way back decades before this, there was no automatic assumption that, oh yeah, John Tyler's the president now and he will fill out the rest of the term. That was all stuff that kind of got developed and was not necessarily understood the same way it is today. When the vice president died, and this happened quite a few times where a vice president died in office, there was no means through which to fill that void until we get up right before it actually gets used. The 25th Amendment, where you're going to see in the 1970s a vice president resign and then get replaced by Gerald Ford, who's then going to become president when the president resigns. None of that was in place at this time.
McKinley's ticket. Behind the scenes, though, McKinley's old patron Mark Hanna was unhappy. Like the president, he despised Teddy's macho style. In meetings, he impressed upon McKinley the need to find someone else. Anyone else. But McKinley knew talent when he saw it. Putting his personal feelings aside, he threw his weight behind the war hero for his VP pick.
And at this time, Roosevelt is the governor of New York.
On decision, the 25th president changed the course of American history. The 1900 election played out like a Disney live-action remake of 1896 that absolutely nobody needed to see. Once again, the Democrats put up William Jennings Bryan. Once again, McKinley trounced him, becoming the first president to be elected for a second consecutive term since Ulysses S. Grant. This time, however, the epilogue would be completely different. Recently, the administration had noticed McKinley receiving an alarming number of death threats. In this era, there was no dedicated Secret Service detail to provide security, just personal bodyguards who tried to urge the president to be more careful around the public. Unfortunately, this was also
quite amazing when you consider that in the span of 36 years, there are 3 presidential assassinations. It's after this third one that they'll finally get it, and they'll finally have a permanent Secret Service detail for the president.
Also an era in which presidents were expected to be approachable, regularly seen chatting to citizens in the street. When McKinley's bodyguards asked him to be less conspicuous, he was basically like, absurd! What America would ever want to harm their president? To which the answer would soon turn out to be Leon Czolgosz. An unemployed Detroit mill worker with anarchist leanings, Czolgosz had gotten it into his head that McKinley was oppressing the working man and needed to be stopped.
Leave it to a guy from Michigan to assassinate a president from Ohio. Just saying.
And since this was the great era of anarchist assassinations, Czolgosz didn't plan to stop McKinley via the ballot box. That September 1901, Czolgosz traveled to Buffalo, where McKinley was speaking at the Pan American Exposition. On September the 6th, the president stood outside the Temple of Music to shake hands with passers-by.
And the next building over is where Robert Todd Lincoln is. Robert Todd Lincoln, the only surviving son of the 4 sons of Abraham Lincoln, who was in Washington when his father was assassinated, who was at the train station with Garfield. He was in Garfield's cabinet when Garfield was assassinated, and was the next building over when McKinley was assassinated.
Despite his bodyguards trying to get him to cut things short, McKinley insisted on continuing his greetings. At 1607, the 25th president turned and held out his hand to the next man. Czolgosz took it, and with his free hand he fired 2 bullets into McKinley's stomach. The pandemonium that followed was bizarre in that, unlike JFK or Lincoln, McKinley remained conscious as it all unfolded. From his wounded position, he begged the angry crowd not to lynch Czolgosz, before turning to his private secretary, a guy called Cortelyou, saying, "My wife, be careful, Cortelyou, how you tell her."
His first thought was the fragility of his wife and his concern for her. McKinley and Garfield 100% would have survived their wounds if they were killed today. Those were both survivable wounds, but with the medicine of the time, even Garfield, with the medicine of the time, probably should have survived. McKinley, infection.
Oh, be careful. In an odd way, it's touching to see how he remained so concerned about Ida to the very end. Not that everyone realized this was really the end. Rushed to hospital, McKinley was declared badly wounded, but likely to survive. Transferred to the nearby home of the exhibition's organizer, he began to recuperate. For several days, it looked like he'd pull through. And then the great horror of the pre-antibiotics world reared its head. Gangrene. The infection that took hold around the wound did what Czolgosz's bullets had failed to do. On the 14th of September 1901, William McKinley died in Buffalo, the 3rd president to be assassinated. He was 58. The reaction to McKinley's death varied wildly by person. On vacation, Teddy Roosevelt found himself forced to hightail it to New York to take the oath of office. Mark Hanna, meanwhile, was seemingly more concerned about Roosevelt's election, snarling, "I told William McKinley it was a mistake to nominate this man in Philadelphia. I asked him if he realized what would happen if he should die. Now look, that damn cowboy is President of the United States." For his part, Leon Czolgosz never showed any remorse. He was executed on October the 29th of that year, his infamy assured.
And if you see video that purports to be of Czolgosz's execution in the electric chair, it's not. It's a recreation that shows what it would have looked like when he was electrocuted, but it isn't actually him.
Mostly, though, the death of McKinley was marked by an outpouring of grief, one so vast it's comparable to the aftermath of JFK's assassination, one that made it seem like his name would live on forever. Instead, it was destined to slip into oblivion. Today, William McKinley sits alongside guys like William Taft and Calvin Coolidge in the special category of significant presidents most people have somehow forgotten about.
So let me show you something real quick, because I've been to the site where McKinley was assassinated. It's a very kind of nondescript location today. So it's up here on the north side of Buffalo, New York, if you go there, and it's in a residential neighborhood. It's like, seriously, like if you look around, there's just houses, and it's on this little like kind of median in the middle of the street with houses on either side, and it's just this little marker that shows you that this is the site of what was the Temple of Music where McKinley was assassinated. It's really crazy.
Despite overseeing a successful war and dying tragically, there remain few monuments to him. Even Mount McKinley in Alaska was officially renamed Denali by the Obama administration in 2016, and so McKinley's great slide into anonymity continues. And in many ways, it's a pity. Although he wasn't perfect, McKinley oversaw a profound transformation in American history, a moment when the US went from being a regional power to a great power that was sitting atop a global empire.
Yeah.
Without his lead, the expansionist presidency of Teddy Roosevelt would have been unthinkable. Take Teddy out of the equation, and you also have no presidents, Taft or Wilson, and suddenly American history starts to look really rather different. Yet McKinley was more than just a prelude to TDR. In his unshowy way, he changed what the presidency could be, changed what America was, how Americans thought about themselves and their place in the world. He may still be obscure today, but we are all still very much living in a future that McKinley helped create.
100% agree. One of the most consequential presidencies in history, whether you agree with the choices he made or not, whether you like the direction it took the country or not, you have to acknowledge he took the country in a very specific direction that was defined in the 20th century. So big thank you to Seth. Sorry I don't have an address for you, Seth, but also Jonathan in Oakley, California. I appreciate your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're going to continue with the theme of U.S. presidential history, with it being President's Day yesterday. Not going to be doing it all week, but going to do it today, and I'm excited to dive back into Biographics. We've been hitting that channel a lot lately, but I've never covered in detail my all-time favorite president. Whenever people ask me that question in streams, I always have the same answer. And my friend JD over the History Underground just recently had a poll question about this very thing. And this is what his poll question looked like. I thought it was a pretty clever way to ask the question, and I 100% agree with him about the answer. So we're going to dive into the story of Theodore Roosevelt today, one of my all-time favorite historical figures of any kind. Before we get into today's story, though, I want to give a shout out and a big thank you to our latest executive producer level patron, Brandon Christian, as well as our latest producer level patron, and I hope I get your name right. Please let me know if I did not pronounce this right. Bienvenido Busadre. I hope I got that right. Please let me know if I didn't. If you want to know what it takes to become a part of our team of supporters on Patreon, there's a link in the description that will take you over to that page, and you can see all the perks that are available and the different rewards. We're going to be unveiling some new ones in the coming days, including one that I think might interest a lot of people, which is going to be the ability, I guess I'm announcing it now, kind of, the ability to see videos a day early. That's going to be something that's exclusive to our patrons and our members. So I'll be rolling that out as soon as I get everything set up and recorded and ready to go for that. But let's go ahead and dive into the story of Theodore Roosevelt. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to see it without my commentary.
Few would have believed that the frail, asthmatic little boy who loved to collect insects would amount to anything special, much less the youngest and most robust president in U.S. history. Theodore Roosevelt's
people forget that Theodore Roosevelt is the youngest president in American history. He absolutely was. I think he was 42 when he became president. Pretty young guy. Not the youngest elected president in history. That was John F. Kennedy, but Roosevelt became president because of an assassination. He was younger than Kennedy.
Transformation from sickly child to master of the bully pulpit and the ultimate symbol of American strength and vitality is an inspiring story of the power of self-determination.
Absolutely.
In this week's Biographics, we uncover his story. Theodore Roosevelt, the future 26th President of the United States, was born in New York City on October the 27th, 1858.
Yeah, as I mentioned yesterday, one of only two presidents that were actually born in New York City, the other one being Donald Trump.
To Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and Martha Bullock Roosevelt. Roosevelt Sr. was one of the leading citizens of New York City. Theodore Jr., who was known as TD, was the second child to the affluent couple who lived in a luxurious home on Manhattan Island. TD had a sister, Anna, who was 4 years older than him. A younger brother, Elliot, would follow 2 years later. And then there was another sister, Corinne, a year after that. TD suffered from asthma from the age of 3. His condition indeed was...
I think that's just his British pronunciation of Teddy. Though I know that, and maybe he'll mention this, that Theodore Roosevelt did not like to be called Teddy. I try whenever possible to avoid using that because I know he didn't like it. He usually preferred TR.
Was so bad that he spent much of his early years in bed. Unable to attend school, his parents hired tutors to teach him from home. Despite his illness, young TD relished the opportunity to learn. Once he had learned how to read, he became a voracious devourer of books. He loved to fill his mind with tales of such Nordic heroes as King Olaf and Eric the Red. He was also fascinated with newspaper stories about the exploits of the famous British explorer, Dr. David Livingstone. TD, he was a dreamer, and he filled his mind with dreams of trekking through uncharted territories and discovering untamed tribes.
And this is something you'll see throughout his life, right? He spends a lot of time out west, which during his lifetime is still kind of a frontier territory, the Wild West. He spends time near the end of his life down in the Amazon and the rainforests and the jungles of South America. And think about the time he's growing up in, right? He is a small child during the American Civil War. He's like 3 years old when the war, or 3 years old when the war breaks out. One of his earliest memories is going to be looking out the window, seeing Abraham Lincoln's funeral, and we have that famous photograph of Theodore Roosevelt and his brother standing in the window. I'm sure they'll probably show it. If not, I'll put a link at the end to my video where I showed that photograph.
Young TD showed an unusual curiosity about the natural world. One day, on a trip to the market, he came across a dead seal in a butcher's stall. He was fascinated with the find and returned daily to study and measure it with a ruler. Eventually, he managed to take possession of the seal's skeleton and take it home, where it became the prize exhibit of his Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, which he had set up in his bedroom.
That's cool.
From the age of 6, TD began filling his journals with observations about the natural world. His mother regularly took him on trips to...
Oh my gosh, first of all, if that was him, he looks so much like his son, the one that we usually refer to as Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was really Theodore Roosevelt III, the one that was a World War II general that died a few weeks after D-Day. Looks just like him there. Wow. Kind of cool hearing about his early life a little bit, because I see a lot of my own 10-year-old son in him. My 10-year-old, he gets interested in something and he just absorbs everything he can about it. And it's really how I was as a kid when it came to history. But with my son, it could be math, it could be science, it could be chess. Man, he just absorbs so many things. I love that.
Journals with observations about the natural world. His mother regularly took him on trips to the country in order to help alleviate his asthma, and TD made the most of this opportunity to wander around in search of fish, insects, seals, and birds that he could analyze and then write about. The Roosevelt children, they were raised under the norms of Victorian society. As members of the upper class, they didn't mix with the less wealthy, and strict mores of decency were enforced, and manners and politeness were of utmost importance.
Do we typically refer to America in this time as Victorian society? I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. I've just never really heard that used in the context of the United States. It is, Queen Victoria is, the Queen in the UK, so it's Victorian there. I just never heard it referred to that way.
Sunday night was the day for religious observance, consisting of church, followed by quiet contemplation. TD hated Sundays, as this was the day when he was not permitted to indulge in his natural curiosity of the world. In 1869, when he was 10 years old, TD's family embarked on a tour of Europe. For 12 months, the children were exposed to the great sights of England, Germany, France, and Italy. Yet, TD, he was not impressed. He later wrote, "I cordially hated it, as did my younger brother and sister. Practically all the enjoyment we had was in exploring any ruins or mountains when we get away from our elders and in playing in our different hotels."
See, I was thinking, I never got to experience things like that growing up, but I was raised by my grandparents, and my grandparents did such an amazing job of embracing my obsession with history that they would plan our vacations around going to battlefields and historic sites, which my grandfather was really into as well. And I always loved it, and my sister hated it. So, if we were in Gettysburg and we had a hotel that was right near the cemetery, I'd go up to the cemetery and I was walking around making notes about interesting soldiers' names that I found and things like that. And my sister just wanted to stay and swim the whole time.
When he was 13, TD's father gave him his first shotgun. He was dismayed to find that he was a terrible shot, which brought ridicule from his peers. When a friend challenged him to hit a billboard in the distance, he discovered the problem, later recalling, "Not only was I unable to read the sign,
he was dyslexic.
I couldn't even see the letters." He was extremely nearsighted.
Nearsighted, yeah. I'm thinking of dyslexic, I'm thinking of George Patton, who was dyslexic.
Realized it. After telling his father about the problem, he was given a pair of eyeglasses. He wrote in his diary, "I had no idea how beautiful the world was until I got those spectacles." With his improved eyesight, TD was able to become even more obsessive with his nature studies. He learned taxidermy, stuffing and mounting birds that he shot, and adding them to his ever-expanding natural history museum. In the winter of 1870 to 1871, the Roosevelts made a trip to the Mediterranean, visiting Egypt, the Holy Land, Syria, Greece, and Turkey. Unlike the trip to Europe, TD loved this experience. He made the most of the opportunity to shoot exotic birds and then stuff them to take home and add to his collection. When he was 13, TD was sent off to Maine for a solo trip to improve his health. On the train journey north, he found himself in a cabin with some other teenage boys. In the skinny, weak, bespectacled, asthmatic boy, they found an easy mark. They roughed him up, leaving him bruised and humiliated. When he returned home, he told his father about the incident. Roosevelt Sr. told his son that he needed to develop his body physically so that he could defend himself. A prize fighter was hired in order to teach the boy how to box.
I didn't know that's how he got into boxing, but I knew he was always very poor health and very weak. And you can start to see how Theodore Roosevelt, the man, develops out of these experiences, right? He had that natural curiosity already, but then his parents fed that by taking him to Europe, by taking him to Africa, to the Middle East, and just fed that natural curiosity that he had. And the fact that he was poor of health meant that he had to develop a perseverance from an early age, and he had to learn how to overcome and how to use his mind to overcome the fact that he had physical difficulties. And so much of this is going to form the man that he becomes.
From this point onward, TD became obsessed with building his body. He began lifting weights, doing calisthenics, and running. He developed a great admiration for those who possessed strength and displayed manly virility. He was also determined to live what he called the strenuous life.
Look at that as a cool picture. The mutton chops.
The Roosevelts were a family that were driven by goals, and after returning from their trip to the Middle East, they set one for their oldest son, and that was to gain entry to Harvard College in just 3 years. This was a terrific challenge for young TD. He had never gone to school, and although he was skilled in languages, nature, and the classics, he was rather deficient in mathematics. A special tutor was hired, and over the next 2 years, he worked hard to improve his skills. The hard work, it paid off, and in 1875, he passed the Harvard entrance exam. For a freshman at Harvard, the childhood name of TD would never have done, so he took to calling himself Theodore. He immediately took to college life, involving himself in political parades, boxing tournaments, and a rowing competition. He also became a skilled debater, taking on professors and fellow students alike. To his delight, he found himself readily accepted and was soon invited to join some of Harvard's most prestigious societies. Theodore's blissful existence was interrupted during a visit home in his sophomore year. He found that his father was gravely ill. With his beloved TD back home, the old man's health revived somewhat and the danger seemed to have passed. But when Theodore returned to Harvard for the new year, his father took a sharp turn for the worst. Towards the end of February, Theodore received a telegram to return home urgently. He never made it in time. His father died that very night. Theodore was deeply depressed as a result of his father's death. However, he refused to show any of this pain to others. Instigating a pattern that he would continue for the rest of his life, he soldiered on, disciplining his mind and body to do what had to be done.
So, a guy who has been born with physical weaknesses that he can't control, right? He's going to control the weaknesses that he can, and if he perceives that showing emotion and showing that, like, feeling depressed is a weakness, which I don't think it is. I think showing those things takes a lot of strength. But in that time, in that place, and in that mindset, and in that culture that he was in, he probably perceived it that way. So he's going to bury that, and he's going to overcome. And this is a guy that doesn't do anything small. He does everything big. And so he probably just poured himself even more into his studies, into his physical health, into the things he could control.
Still, his grief, it was evident in his actions. During a summer vacation to Oyster Bay, he rode his horse to exhaustion. When a dog insisted on chasing the horse, he turned and he shot it. Theodore also began hiking, finding a release in the great outdoors. He teamed with a crusty old adventurer by the name of Bill Sewell, who served as his guide. Sewell later recorded his impression of Theodore Roosevelt at the time, stating, "He was fair-minded, Theodore was, and then he took pains to learn everything. There was nothing beneath his notice. I liked him right off. I liked him clear, though."
I like these quotes from people that we don't really hear much about because they're just describing their impressions. And we get these all throughout history, these descriptions by people who are in close proximity to famous people at non-famous moments of their lives, just describing what they remember about them, what they remember about their voice, about the way they carried themselves. Because you can look at a picture or even video and not really know somebody. But when you hear these little descriptions, it really helps you to understand the impression they made on others.
There wasn't a quality in him I didn't like. He wasn't headlong or aggressive, except when necessary, and as far as I could see, he wasn't a bit cocky, though other folks thought so. By his mid-teens, Theodore had developed into quite a character. Never afraid to express his opinion, he could always be counted on to be the center of attention. His unique outbursts of approval, bully and delighted, quickly became trademark responses. In 1879, he set his charms on a young woman by the name of Alice Lee. "See that girl?" he said to a Harvard pal. "She won't have me, but I'm going to have her." And have her he did. He set out on a campaign to win Alice's heart, leading to their engagement in early 1880. Theodore graduated from Harvard in June of that year, 21st in his class of 160 students.
Good.
Then, in October, he and Alice were married. After a short honeymoon, Theodore enrolled in a law degree at Columbia University while also working at his uncle's law firm. During his limited leisure time, he decided to learn about the War of 1812. When he couldn't find a decent book on the subject, he decided to write one himself. During the summer...
This classic Theodore Roosevelt. I can't find a good book about this topic. All right, well, I'll just have to make one then.
Of 1881, the young couple took a trip to Europe. While in Switzerland, Theodore left his wife behind while he climbed the Matterhorn. It was during this trip that he decided to forego a legal career. He was determined to set his sights on becoming a politician.
It's amazing to think that at this point he's just graduated from college, he's just gotten married, and in 20 years he's going to be president of the United States. It's crazy.
Back then, politics was actually seen as being beneath men of wealth, and various friends tried to dissuade Theodore's ambitions. But that was always going to be a losing proposition, and...
You don't tell Theodore Roosevelt what to do. And in fact, if you tell him what to do, he's probably more likely to do the opposite.
On returning to New York, he joined the Republican Party. Here, he was associating with a class of men that he hadn't previously mixed with, rough men who were skilled in the low blows and dirty tricks of state politics. Roosevelt soon learned their ways, and within months had won the party's nomination for a seat in the New York State Assembly. It was a solid Republican seat, and Roosevelt, he won it handily. Roosevelt turned up to take his seat at the New York State Capitol in Albany on January the 22nd, 1882. He cut the figure of a dandy with his fine suit and his upper-crust ways. He was ridiculed by Democrats as well as Republicans. Despite this, he, according to his own recollection, rose like a rocket in New York politics. Roosevelt's politics, they were grounded in self-determination. He firmly believed that each man was in control of his own destiny.
And why does he believe that? Because he has had to do that himself. Now, it's interesting, obviously, to think about the fact that this is a guy who's born into great wealth and privilege and had a lot of things given to him that might not have been afforded to other people. The ability to travel to Europe and the Middle East and Africa. His parents being able to get him private tutors to teach him things. You know, those sorts of things weren't things that were going to be available to everybody, but he still ends up being a champion of the people who want to just make a living for themselves and want to be able to stand up on their own 2 feet. And that gets him into trouble with some people who are of a like background of him that don't see things the same way.
But he also realized that the system, it was grossly unfair, with those with the money and power having all of the opportunities. He made it his goal to bring about a fairer system where all Americans had the opportunity to succeed. When he wasn't working his way up the political ladder in New York, Theodore ventured out west in order to fulfill his love of adventure and the outdoors. In September of 1883, he made an excursion to the Dakota Badlands with the express purpose of bringing home a buffalo head as a trophy.
And remember, this is just 7 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is just a couple of years after things like the Lincoln County War with Billy the Kid and those guys. We're right around the time of some of the most famous Wild West stories happening is when he's out there.
Most things he set his mind to, he was successful in that goal. During this trip, he also purchased a cattle ranch. In November of 1883, Theodore won his third term to the New York State Assembly. He returned to Albany while his wife, who was heavily pregnant with their first child, went to live with his sister. On February the 11th, 1884, he received a long-awaited telegram announcing the birth of a baby girl. But this telegram had also told him that Alice was very sick. He rushed home to discover that the news was even worse. Both his wife and his mother were gravely ill. They both died on the same day, February the 14th, 1884. That night he wrote in his diary, "The light has gone from my life."
There's a picture of that, and you can see me tearing up because I knew that part of the story was coming. He lost his mom and his wife. One was upstairs and one was downstairs in the same house on the same day. And he did. There's a big X in his journal that day. And I thought, let me take a look, see if I can find the picture. See, there was something that wasn't sitting right with me when he read that quote because I thought it was "the light has gone out of my life," and that is what it is. It wasn't "the light has gone from my life." Minor thing, but still. There's what he wrote that day with a big X. The day that he lost the two most important women in his life. I mean, just imagine what that does to a young man. He's what, 25 at this point? Can't imagine.
Theodore responded to the double tragedy with the stoicism that epitomized his personality. After a few days of isolation, he left the baby in the care of his sister and returned to Albany to see out his term in the General Assembly. Life had to go on. Throughout 1884, Roosevelt worked tirelessly to propel himself from state to national politics. His brash, unwavering style brought him the attention of prominent men, including an influential Bostonian by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge. By the end of the year, the 25-year-old was being eyed by many as a future Republican leader. However, inside Roosevelt was an empty man. Yeah. He needed to get away from the rough and tumble of politics in order to heal himself.
So, we all have these moments, these crossroads moments in our lives, right, where we have to make a choice and we make a decision that will impact the rest of our lives. And, what would have happened if Theodore Roosevelt didn't take this break and go out west and kind of just take some time for himself after this tragedy that he experienced? Does he rise sooner? Maybe. Does his rise happen at all without those things? Hard to say. These are important questions to ask.
At the end of 1884, Roosevelt retired from politics and moved to one of his ranches in North Dakota. Theodore Roosevelt turned up to the small Dakota town of Medora dressed in buckskins. He brandished a brand new Winchester rifle as well as a hunting knife that he'd bought from Tiffany's jewelers. He was the quintessential dude and was soon ridiculed by the hardened locals. Despite this, he reveled in life in the West. He displayed a steely courage which impressed all those who came to know him. Roosevelt hired his old tramping guide, Bill Sewell, to come out and manage his ranch for him. But he didn't leave all the hard work to his men. He rode out on the range with them, chased spooked cattle, and stood guard during long and bitterly cold nights. In 1886, he captured a group of thieves who had stolen a boat and then took them as prisoners on a 3-day trek to the local sheriff. During those 3 days, he didn't sleep a wink as he kept his rifle trained on his captives. Following the exceptionally harsh winter of 1886 to 1887, which killed half of his cattle stock, Roosevelt, he returned east. He was 30 pounds heavier than when he left and was a harder, more confident version of himself. Soon after returning, he met up and fell in love with a childhood friend by the name of Edith Caro. They were married on December 2nd, 1886, and would go on to have 5 children together.
Yeah, it happens fast now. I mean, we're 15 years from being
Roosevelt
president.
was soon approached by Republican leaders and urged to re-enter politics. They wanted him to run for mayor of New York. He accepted and campaigned hard despite having little chance of winning. He came in 3rd place with 27% of the vote. Thinking that his political career was over, he next put his efforts into writing the book The Winning of the West. In 1888, Roosevelt gave stump speeches for Republican presidential candidate Benjamin Harrison. When he won the presidency, Harrison was persuaded by Theodore's political champion, Henry Cabot Lodge, to appoint the energetic Roosevelt to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. He took to the role with a vengeance, determined to fight.
I don't know that Theodore Roosevelt knows how to do anything any other way but then to take that role with a vengeance.
The corrupt spoils system and enforce civil service laws. In 1894, Roosevelt was appointed president of the board of New York City Police Commissioners.
So it's important to note here, too, that we're going to see some themes in Roosevelt's life during this time that are going to define his presidency, right? Reform, making things as he sees them more fair, more right. Right, so he's appointed the Civil Service Commission, the civil service job right in that time in history where there's all the civil service reform is going on, where they're going from the spoils system to a more merit-based system, giving people jobs not because you owe them political favors, but because they're qualified for the jobs. And now he's going to take that same attitude into the police commissioner job, and then he's going to take that same attitude into his future roles as a governor, as an assistant secretary of the Navy, as president.
He then set about making improvements to the structure of the police force, rooting out corruption and imposing more stringent standards for recruitment. In 1897, again under the urging of Henry Cabot Lodge, new President William McKinley appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He became a strong advocate for the building of the strength of the Navy. When, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. warship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, Roosevelt took it upon himself to order a number of ships to prepare for war.
Yeah, so it's interesting here. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's not the Secretary of the Navy, but if you look at newspapers from the time of the USS Maine, whose name do you see all over those? Theodore Roosevelt, not the Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt, even though he's not the guy at the top, is the guy running the show.
When war was declared a short time later, Roosevelt resigned his post and formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. He was determined to be in the thick of the action. The press dubbed Roosevelt's cavalry regiment the Rough Riders. After a period of training in San Antonio, Texas, they were shipped to Cuba.
There's a movie about that, by the way, with Tom Berenger playing Theodore Roosevelt, and I think actually doing a really good job of playing Theodore Roosevelt. I definitely recommend you check it out.
First action was at the Battle of Las Guasimas, where they forced the Spanish to abandon their entrenched positions. On July 1, 1898, Roosevelt led his men on the famous charge up Kettle Hill. He was the only man on horseback, making an easy target for the enemy. Still, without any care for his own safety, he rode up and down the line, urging his men up the hill. Also attempting to take the hill were soldiers of the 9th U.S. Cavalry, but these soldiers were having a hard time of it. A reporter for the New York Times recorded the action, stating, "Colonel Roosevelt on horseback broke from the woods behind the line of the 9th and, finding its men lying in his way, shouted, 'If you do not wish to go forward, let my men pass, please.' The junior officers of the 9th with their Negroes instantly sprang into line with the Rough Riders and charged at the blue block house on the right. I speak of Roosevelt first because he was, without doubt, the most conspicuous figure in the charge. Roosevelt, mounted high on horseback and charging the rifle pits at a gallop and quite alone, made you feel that you would like to cheer. He wore on his sombrero a blue polka-dot handkerchief, which, as he advanced, floated out straight behind his head like a guidon. Having reached the crest of the hill, Roosevelt dismounted and urged his men to follow him. But there was yet another hill to conquer, and no sooner had the Rough Riders scrambled to the top of Kettle Hill than their dashing colonel set off for San Juan Hill. His men overpowered the Spanish resistance and took possession of both hills. In the process, Roosevelt killed a Spanish trooper who, he said, doubled over like a jackrabbit. Following victory in Cuba, Roosevelt returned to New York, where he was convinced to run for governor.
And Roosevelt would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, although it didn't happen until the last couple of decades. I want to say it was Bill Clinton. It was during his administration that Theodore Roosevelt got the Medal of Honor. So making him part of only two father-son combinations to both receive the Medal of Honor. He received his many decades after his son received his for his actions on D-Day for landing. I think it was at, was it Utah Beach? I think it was Utah Beach. But the other father-son combination were Arthur MacArthur and Douglas MacArthur. So,
campaigning vigorously on his war record, he won by just 1% of the popular vote. During his time as governor, he developed the style and platform which would underpin his later presidency. He was a passionate advocate for the rights of the underprivileged, was against large corporations and monopolies, and championed the preservation of natural resources. In 1900, Henry Cabot Lodge and other prominent Republicans urged Roosevelt to throw his hat into the ring for the vacant Republican vice presidential spot in the upcoming presidential elections. Though reluctant, he won the Republican nomination, pairing with President McKinley.
Now, you'll often hear the argument made, and I think it's a fair one to make, that a lot of Republicans didn't like how progressive Theodore Roosevelt was. This is right at the beginning of kind of the progressive era. And remember, William McKinley is elected in no small part because of the money of the big, what we call the robber barons, right? The guys like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. You know, there was a lot of big business money behind William McKinley getting elected. And Theodore Roosevelt's going to be a guy who's very much going to be at odds with those same guys. And so here's this very young, up and coming, everybody can see up and coming, war hero now, well-spoken, a lot of perseverance, a lot of strength of character, governor of New York. And a lot of Republicans saw the vice presidency as a place to send him to die, basically, to be quiet and to not have any influence and not have the ability to make things happen. Of course, that only works as long as the president's alive.
With his boundless energy, he threw himself into a barnstorming campaign, making 480 speeches in 23 states. In the end, he and McKinley easily won, and Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as the Vice President of the United States on March 1st, 1901. 6 months later, President McKinley was shot while attending the Pan American Exposition in New York.
I paused again, and typically they don't make these mistakes, so I don't know who was writing the stuff. I paused again because I thought March 1st does not sound right for the beginning of a term. It was March 4th that he was sworn in as vice president. I think it was in the 1930s when we switched it to January 20th. But yeah, it was March 4th. Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
6 months later, President McKinley was shot while attending the Pan American Exposition in New York. He died 8 days later. As a result, the 42-year-old Roosevelt was propelled into the highest office in the land, becoming the 26th President of the United States on September 14th, 1901. He was the youngest man to ever hold the position. Roosevelt.
What's kind of interesting is that so far these high offices that he's held, he hasn't held any of them for very long, right? He's only assistant secretary of the Navy for like a year. He isn't governor for very long because he immediately goes, he goes from assistant secretary of the Navy to a volunteer in the Spanish-American War to governor of New York, and now to vice president, and now to president.
Was a very different man to William McKinley. Still, he vowed that he would continue to pursue the policies of his predecessor. At the same time, he was determined to stamp his mark on the presidency in order to win a second term in his own right. A large part of the focus of Roosevelt's domestic policies were focused on breaking up the monopolies of big business. He instituted 44 antitrust suits, forcing the breaking up of the Northern Securities Company and putting regulatory controls on Standard Oil.
Yeah, and this is going to be one of the things that defines him. But think about, I mean, the man's going to be president for a little less than 8 years. And incredible amount of stuff that happens in those 8 years that he's responsible for. Not just the antitrust stuff, but the FDA and things with national parks. It's important to note, too, in a short biography, they can't cover every little thing. But by this point, his brother has taken his own life, and that brother will be the father of future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who's Theodore Roosevelt's niece.
Of all the domestic policies that Roosevelt was passionate about, however, none came close to the preservation of wildlife and the environment. He established the United States Forest Service, created 5 national parks, and placed a total of 230 million acres of land under public protection. In terms of foreign policy, Roosevelt, he was an ardent imperialist. He successfully mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth, which brought an end to the Russo-Japanese War, winning a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. His making of a
only person to have a Medal of Honor for war and a Nobel Prize for peace.
Deal with the Panamanian government for the building of a canal led to the separation of Panama from Colombia in 1903. In the 1904 presidential election, the Democrats put up Alton Brooks Parker to face off against Roosevelt. Campaigning on the promise to give every American a square deal, Roosevelt won 56% of the popular vote, along with 336 of 476 electoral votes. During his second term in office, Roosevelt began moving to the left of his Republican base.
Yeah.
He pushed for a number of pretty radical reforms.
So there's an interesting thing to note there about the man, right? He kind of saw his first term as really McKinley's term. And so while he did some things that he was really behind, he didn't really go as progressive as he probably wanted to. Once he got elected in his own right, he probably saw, well, now I have a mandate from the American people who have specifically voted for me. Now I'm going to do what I feel is right.
Reforms including the 8-hour workday, most of which they were defeated in the House. He had declared that he would not seek a third term, and so he became a lame duck president. While thoroughly enjoying the role of president, he felt that staying in office for more than 2 terms would run the risk of dictatorship.
Until Taft goes off the rails in his mind.
Following the end of his second term in office in March of 1909, Roosevelt went on an African safari with a group of prominent scientists and hunters. The expedition was on behalf of the Smithsonian Institute and was charged with bringing back specimens for the Institute's museums. The trip was successful and the group came back with 11,400 specimens ranging from insects to elephants. When he returned to the United
Makes me wonder how many of the things we see in the Natural History Museum to this day at the Smithsonian were things that were brought back by that expedition that Theodore Roosevelt was a part of. I know that whenever you go to the Smithsonian museums, you're only typically seeing a very small part of their collection at any one time, so they rotate it, because you can't see everything all the time.
States. Roosevelt was far from happy with the performance of his successor, William Taft, believing that Taft had made the Republicans far too conservative. He began to speak loudly of leading a program of new nationalism which emphasized labor over capital. By the time that the 1912 presidential election rolled around, Roosevelt was convinced that only he could save the Republican Party. He challenged Taft in the Republican primary. However, Taft won the nomination, squeezing Roosevelt to the sidelines. Undeterred, Roosevelt quit the Republicans, forming his own party, the Progressives, and he ran.
Much as I love you, Theodore Roosevelt, this part's hard for me because I know what happens because of the choice he makes.
And for president as an independent. He then went to the stumps and appealed to the people. On October the 14th, 1912, Roosevelt was giving a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when he was struck by an assassin's bullet. This shot was a perfect shot to the heart, and it penetrated his breast pocket and slammed into a thick glasses case. The bullet then thumped into a heavy speech manuscript that he had chosen not to use. Without missing a beat, Roosevelt ensured that the would-be killer was apprehended. Then he went right on with his speech. The first words to the crowd after being hit were, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose."
If you could sum up a human being in one quote that they speak over their 60 years of life, there it is. Right there. The man was shot in the chest. He's 50 years old. And he realized he hadn't coughed up any blood, so it probably hadn't gone into his lung. And so he finished I think it was like an hour-long speech, which is why it was so thick in his pocket.
The bullet stayed in Roosevelt's pectoral muscle until his death.
Yep.
The 1912 presidential election, it was won by the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson with 42% of the popular vote. However, Roosevelt did beat the incumbent president with 27% compared to 23% for Taft. During a South American expedition in 1913 to 1914, Roosevelt contracted tropical fever after suffering a leg wound which became badly infected. By the time he returned to New York, he was 50 pounds lighter and deathly pale.
And I think one of his sons was with him on that expedition, and at one point, Theodore Roosevelt actually told them to leave him behind and leave him to die because he was that sick on that trip. And a lot of people speculate that it's that trip that killed him. Even though it took several more years. That trip combined with his son's death in World War I really kind of did him in. And so had he been elected to that third term, maybe he lives a longer life.
The last few years were racked with pain for the once robust outdoor adventurer. Malaria bouts were common, as were complications of his leg inflammation. The end came in the very early morning hours of January the 6th, 1919.
I'm a little disappointed they are going to just completely gloss over the fact that all 5 of his children served in Europe during World War I. In uniform, including his daughter. I know she was there. I don't know if she was in uniform in the military, but she was definitely there serving as well. But his son, Quentin, is going to be shot down in the summer of 1918 in the war. And that was, as you can imagine, pretty hard on him. And he died just months later.
After he had complained about not being able to breathe the night before. The doctor was summoned, and after some treatment, he felt better. However, he died in his sleep as a result of a blood clot in the lungs. When he heard of his father's demise, his oldest son Archibald telegraphed his siblings with the words, "The old lion is dead." Theodore Roosevelt, he was 60 years old. So I really hope you found that video interesting.
Yeah, and there's a quote that somebody gave about that, and I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. That was basically death had to take Theodore Roosevelt in his sleep because if he'd have been awake, there would have been a fight. There's so much more to his story than they can cover, obviously, in a 20-minute documentary. I definitely recommend you check out Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelt. It's not just about him, but about Franklin Roosevelt as well, which he gave his niece away at her wedding to Franklin Roosevelt. And so they knew each other. Even though they were from different political parties, they knew each other and had known each other quite well, knew that they were distantly related themselves, like fifth cousins or something. Which might seem close, but I'm fifth cousins with Elvis Presley, so it's not that close, I guess. But definitely hope that gets you interested enough to want to learn more about the man, because there's so much more to his story that's fascinating and worth your time. So check it out. I'll put some links down in the description as well as up on the screen for some other things you can check out as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, hopefully many of you have by now seen the sit-down conversation that I was able to have with Susan Eisenhower, who is the granddaughter of Dwight David Eisenhower, our President of the United States, and also one of our leading generals from the Second World War. So I thought it'd be a really good time to take a deeper dive into Eisenhower's story. I know some about his story, and I'm learning more all the time. I'm currently reading Susan's book about how he led, and I've been really impressed so far by just his style of leadership and the way he was able to deal with really huge personalities and do it all without belittling people and without having to resort to some of the things that people sometimes resort to when they get into power. So we're going to take a look at Biographics. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to be able to see it without my commentary. And at the end, I will throw the link to my sit-down interview with Susan Eisenhower, so you can check that out if you haven't already seen it. Let's dive in.
When scholars rank US presidents, there are 4 20th century names that always break the top 10. FDR, Truman, Teddy Roosevelt, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the most popular men of his era, Eisenhower had the fortune to lead America through a prolonged economic boom. During his tenure, the middle class drastically expanded, poverty was reduced, and peace and stability reigned. This was the era of TV's first golden age of consumer choice of exciting new technology. When films and shows like Happy Days and Back to the Future wanted to portray American innocence, it would be to Eisenhower's era that they returned again and again.
Yeah, that's true. And, we have to recognize, too, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Eisenhower's leadership. I think he was one of our best presidents. In fact, I typically rank him right around 5th when I'm ranking presidents. But it's also important for us to note that sometimes people come along at times in history that are naturally predisposed to either be good or bad. Some of the presidents leading up to the American Civil War, anything other than an extraordinary leader would probably have been remembered as a failure during those times just because of everything that was going on. And this time in history, post-World War II, as we're getting into the Cold War and starting to deal with civil rights, it was a challenging era, but there were a lot of things that the United States had going for it after the war, after the economic boom that happens because of the war. So I think most presidents would have probably done okay in that time, but Eisenhower obviously is remembered as being an exceptional leader.
Yet who really was the man at the center of it all? Who was the president who steered the nation through one of its most iconic decades? Born in modest circumstances in North Texas, Eisenhower grew up fascinated with the military. Joining the army as a young man, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming supreme commander of Allied forces during D-Day. Swept to the presidency on the back of his wartime popularity, he promised an era of optimism. His successes and failures would define an entire generation.
Good looking guy.
You know how some kids know from the age of 4 exactly what they want to do with their lives? Well, that was Dwight D. Eisenhower all over. From almost the moment he could read, the future president wanted to be in the military.
Yeah, and that sets him apart from some other folks who didn't necessarily set out. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, had no interest whatsoever in being a military guy. Even after he went to West Point, he didn't want to be in the military. He wanted to be a professor. But some people just have that drive. And, we don't necessarily think of Ike as this really driven kind of want to be in charge guy, but he really was that guy. The way he comes across, he doesn't seem arrogant about it like a MacArthur, for example. But Ike had every bit that desire. And he was actually born David Dwight Eisenhower. And it flipped at some point.
Born on October the 14th, 1890, in a ramshackle house in Denison, North Texas, there had been nothing in Eisenhower's background that indicated army material. His father was a blue-collar worker, while his mother was a pacifist Mennonite who considered war almost as immoral as laziness. For young Ike, as Eisenhower was known, that meant a boyhood of prayer and hard work. It also meant inheriting a hilariously Victorian attitude to society.
And the Eisenhowers are originally from the area of South and Southeast Pennsylvania. A lot of roots there that he had. His family just a couple generations earlier had moved west. Of course, we identify him with Kansas, but like a lot of presidents, he was born in one state but grew up in another or became associated with another.
Even when he was president, Ike would blush crimson if he ever accidentally used a cuss word in front of a woman. Yet behind this strict religious upbringing, behind this facade of a blue-collar, football-loving boy, lurked an ambition that would shape the nation. Whenever he had a moment to spare, Eisenhower devoured books about military history. Although he kept it quiet from his mum, it's not too hard to imagine he already had his heart set on an army career. The first step in realizing this dream came in 1911. By now living with his folks in Kansas, Ike had grown into an athletic, competitive man whose stern discipline masked a volcanic temper. He was also a supremely hard worker. After graduating high school, Ike made a pact with his brother Edgar to work for 2 years to pay Edgar's tuition fees, after which Edgar would go out to work to support Eisenhower's studies. True to his word, Ike had taken 2 jobs to keep Edgar in education, barely giving himself enough time to sleep.
Think about the kind of person that is. You're driven, you're ambitious, you have your own plans, but no, I'm going to take 2 years out of my life, and I'm going to work hard to help my brother get ahead. It tells you a lot about the guy, that while he was driven, while he was ambitious, while he had goals and things he wanted to accomplish, he also was willing to lay those aside to help other people get ahead.
But before Edgar could fulfill his side of the bargain, good news came Eisenhower's way. West Point Military Academy was going to accept him free of charge. For most of the family, this is the first they learned of the young man's military ambitions. It's said that his pacifist mom burst into tears, but there was no talking the boy out of it. He enrolled at the academy and promptly settled into being utterly average.
Utterly average. But you know what? Some of the utterly average classes, our folks in these classes at West Point, end up going to great things. That's one of the weird things about education sometimes, right? Some people can be so terrible at certain subjects, but they're really, really good at what matters for their future career. And in the end, that's really all that matters.
Yep, that burning ambition of Eisenhower's hadn't extended to being a great officer or a great general. He was content to coast by, to do the bare minimum required to fulfill his dream of seeing action. We can see this from his ranking at graduation. 61st out of 164. Solid, but certainly not spectacular. Still, this was nearly enough. In spring of 1917, the USA declared war on Germany. By now married to Mamie Geneva Dowd, who had met while stationed in San Antonio, Ike had every reason to hope America's entry into World War I would prove to be his shot at glory. Even though he was forced to spend the year in charge of a tank training center in Pennsylvania, the Army was soon shipping people out by the thousands.
So if you are a young officer right out of West Point and suddenly there is a major world war that happens, this is your chance to get ahead, right? Because think about it, in the peacetime army, the advancement opportunities really aren't there. And guys like George Patton find this out, right? He's a colonel in World War I, but then he gets reverted back to his peacetime rank, and it takes him another 2 decades to get back up to being a colonel again in the peacetime army. And so seeing action, leading troops in combat, that's your ticket to any chance of advancement, especially if you're 60th in a class of 160 some at West Point. But that's not Ike's path to leadership. He never leads troops in combat, ever in his life. But people in his life, especially superiors over him, are going to recognize his qualities as a staff officer. And that's where he's going to get ahead.
In late 1918, Ike finally got the call. Well, before he could set out for Europe, history intervened. In November 1918, World War I ended. Eisenhower must have been the only person on Earth upset to see the carnage over.
So he was in charge of a tank training school at Camp Colt, which is in Gettysburg. And so that's his first connection to Gettysburg, which is going to kind of become his home after World War II. But for most of the time he's there, for a good bit of the time he's there, they don't have tanks. And so he's thinking, okay, well, what is a tank but a moving gun platform? And so he actually uses trucks to train guys on how to fire from a moving vehicle. And so he gets innovative and he thinks of whatever he can do. But thinking about the fact that tanks are going to play such an important role in World War II, guys like Eisenhower, guys like Patton, who have experience with tanks, are going to become vital in that war.
Grouching that it missed his big opportunity, he instead turned to working with an army buddy named Cameo Alert George S. Patton on a series of articles advising the military to invest in tanks for future conflicts. But rather than being like, cool, consider us advised, the army brass were more like, no podcast president is going to tell us what to do. Indeed, they threatened him with a court-martial. Shunted off to the Panama Canal Zone, told to keep his opinions to himself, Eisenhower could have faded into obscurity then and there, had it not been for one man. Down in Panama, Ike's commanding officer was General Fox Connor, a guy who valued creative thinking. When he heard the younger man's ideas for the future of warfare, Connor didn't threaten him with punishment. Instead, he pulled some strings and got him into the prestigious Command and General Staff College. This was where the future of the military was made.
If you get sent to this place, it's the fast track. This is the place that people look to when they want staff officers when they want high-ranking leadership. And if you look back through history over the last 100 years or so, most of the guys who rise up to high military rank go through here. So just like is the case with most people, very few people rise to the top on their own. They have to have help along the way. They have people who recognize their abilities, who recognize their talent, and give them the push, give them the bump, give them the position that they need to be able to get ahead.
A place for the creme de la creme of the officer corps. Connor was taking a huge gamble sending an average soldier like Eisenhower there. But it was a gamble that would pay off for the entire world.
Yep.
Now, before we go any further with Dwight's story, let's have a quick... Now let's get ready for war. Once Eisenhower got into Command and General Staff College, he never looked back. When he graduated in 1926, he was first in his class of 245. From there, it was the Army War College, then traveling with big shot generals to get experience. But the biggest, shottiest general of them all was still to come. In 1933, Eisenhower became an aide for Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur. Yeah, that Douglas MacArthur. Fan of corncob pipes, aviator sunglasses, and generally being an all-round hard ass.
So it's important to note that even once we get into World War II, because I see a lot of people commenting, for example, on my video, my short where I talked about Ulysses S. Grant getting the opportunity to be promoted to General of the Armies of the United States, which is kind of an equivalent of a 6-star rank. And people say, well, what about Eisenhower? Well, remember, Eisenhower was not even the highest ranking member of the U.S. military during the Second World War. He was outranked by both Marshall and Douglas MacArthur. And by outranked, what I mean is they all had the same rank, but the date of your rank established the order of seniority, and those two guys both outranked Ike.
It was a prime posting for a rising star like Eisenhower, a chance to see the baddest general of them all up close and personal. But god damn, it would be a bumpy ride. Like Eisenhower, MacArthur had a foul temper and an unwillingness to back down. During the 6 or so years they worked together, mostly in the Philippines, Eisenhower would find himself tearing what little remained of his hair out, trying to get MacArthur to listen. Still, the experience taught him a lot and sent him climbing ever further up the ranks.
So think about this, right? What's Eisenhower going to have to do in World War II? He's going to have to deal with big, stubborn personalities, right? He's going to have to deal with Churchill. He's going to have to deal with Montgomery. He's going to have to deal with Patton. He's going to have to deal with de Gaulle. And that was one of the things that we talked about, me and Susan Eisenhower, was his ability to handle delicate situations in such a way that left everybody in a better situation. That is not easy to do. And I'm guessing he learned a lot about how to deal with people like that from having to serve with MacArthur.
That meant that Ike was in the perfect place career-wise when war broke out again in Europe. Sent back to the USA in 1940, Eisenhower was promoted to Chief of Staff of the Third Army just in time for the legendary Louisiana maneuvers. By 1940, the American military was modernizing like crazy in case war came, and everyone needed some practice to figure out how to wield this high-powered new fighting machine. So General George C. Marshall basically had his men pick out an empty patch of Louisiana and said, well, that'll do, and sent nearly 500,000 troops down there to wargame the crap out of it.
Yeah, and this is probably a topic we need to cover more in depth, right? Because this is where some of the early leadership of the military, guys like Patton, guys like Eisenhower, are going to start to get on people's radar screens. And George C. Marshall, during the First World War, he was like a mid-level staff officer, right? He's like a major, and I think later on a colonel. But he basically was given the job by Pershing of running the war for the Americans. He's on Pershing's staff, and he's the one who's creating the plans and kind of directing the show. And so, like Eisenhower, he gets recognized by those over him as someone who's got a career ahead.
Did Eisenhower shine during the maneuvers? Yeah, of course he did. Eisenhower's strategic planning in Louisiana was so impressive that he was promoted straight to Brigadier General.
And this is one of the things that another thing that I heard Susan Eisenhower talking about, wasn't in our interview, but it was something she talked about at another point when we were talking, is that when Dwight first goes to Gettysburg, when he's in his younger days, right, he was kind of bored by the tactics, the talk about this division went here and this brigade did this. He was a strategic thinker. He was asking questions like, okay, well, why did they end up in Gettysburg? What brought them here? What was going on in the war to that point? And it was obvious from his earliest days that Ike was a big picture guy. He's a strategic planner. When we're talking about strategy, we're talking about the war as a whole. And we're talking about logistics and maneuvers and entire army groups moving, whereas tactics is the small level part of things. So Ike was a big strategy guy.
Just in time, too, because that December, World War II finally caught up with America. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was the beginning of Eisenhower's stratospheric rise through the ranks. Sent to D.C. to work on war plans, he caught the eye of General Marshall, who promoted him right the way up to commander of U.S. troops in Europe. Partly this was due to Eisenhower's ability, but it was also due to him being the sort of person that people trusted.
Yeah, he gets sent over as a brigadier general to kind of observe and to kind of start making connections in Europe. And it's through that process. In fact, if you want to see a portrayal of this, I don't remember the name of it, but Robert Duvall played Ike in, I think it was a TV miniseries. And you see all of those kind of early parts of what Ike does when he first goes over there as this brigadier general amongst a bunch of generals and colonels and things like that. He's really nobody special, but he does such a great job of communicating what the needs are in Europe back to Marshall, that Marshall just continues to see greatness in him and continues to elevate him.
Remember that old political slogan, "I like Ike"? Well, it worked because liking Ike was exactly what people did. Despite his discipline and strict religious background, Dwight Eisenhower was one of those guys you just can't help but want to be around. He was clever, funny, plain-spoken, but also sharply intelligent and persuasive. As the great British World War II officer Bernard Montgomery put it, he has the power of drawing the hearts of men toward him as a magnet attracts the bit of metal.
Which is huge at a time when you have guys like Monty and Patton and MacArthur who are great generals, but not necessarily very likable people at times. This is the kind of guy. Ike really was built for the Supreme Allied Commander role, right? Because it's a strategic role, so it requires a great strategic mind, but it's also a political role where you have to be able to deal with personalities in delicate situations and keep everybody happy. He was built for this.
He merely has to smile at you, and you trust him at once. In other words, Eisenhower was basically the military equivalent of the brainy, beautiful prom queen everyone wants to be around, only instead of a homecoming parade, he got to invade North Africa. Launched in November 1942, Operation Torch saw the Allies overrun Vichy France's colonies, triggering a revolution in Algeria and helping to bring the North Africa campaign crashing to a close. Although Eisenhower's planning wasn't perfect, mistakes were made, including the assumption that French colonial forces would welcome them as liberators. He did the job. With North Africa secured, Eisenhower was able to pivot to overseeing the invasion of Sicily, the campaign that led to Mussolini being removed from power.
So yeah, it's important to know, were mistakes made? Yeah, how much of that was Ike's fault? I'm not sure a lot of it was, but anytime you're doing something for the first time in a new role, there's going to be a learning curve. There are going to be adjustments. There's going to be things you're going to be like, okay, we learned from this. And Sicily is going to be another area where they're going to learn some things that they're going to be able to apply then to Normandy. But again, this is Ike doing Ike things. He's removing people who aren't performing well, and this is where he's going to put a guy like Patton in command of American troops, and this is where he's going to have to start dealing with multiple personalities.
As Italy collapsed into two warring states, one aligned with the Allies, the other with the Axis, it became clear that the wind was changing direction. That the much-promised invasion of France might now even be possible. Care to guess who'd be leading it? In later life, when he was president, Dwight Eisenhower was asked by his brother Milton to read the commencement address at Penn State. The morning of the big speech, big storms blew up, threatening the ceremony. Panicked, Milton asked his brother for advice if the weather turned. In response, Ike merely smiled and said, "Milton, I haven't worried about the weather since June the 6th, 1944. That's because June the 6th was the day Eisenhower had overseen the greatest seaborne invasion in history, D-Day." Promoted to Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force on Christmas Eve 1943, Eisenhower had spent the previous 6 months liaising in London with Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle to make sure that things went right. There were a lot of ways they could have gone wrong. Because of the tidal requirements and the need for a full moon, there were only a few days of any given month when the landings could be pulled off. That meant bad weather could throw not just Eisenhower's plans, but the fate of the whole of Europe into disarray.
And it had to be early enough, too, that you weren't going to get yourself in a situation where you were going to be bogged down by the winter. Your hope was to get across and make enough headway that by the time you get to winter, either the war is over or at least you've pushed your way significantly toward Germany. Do not underestimate the importance of and the weight of the decisions he had to make. You got guys like Trafford Leigh-Mallory, who's in charge of the Allied airborne operations, telling him, listen, if you do this, we're going to lose like 75% of these airborne guys. And him having to make that call anyway. And thankfully, it wasn't anywhere near that number. And if you want a great view into all of that part of Ike's decision-making, watch the story of Ike as played by Tom Selleck without a mustache. Does a great job of showing the tension involved in those. And even things like this guy, Group Captain Stagg, who is the guy in charge of the weather and how important the weather forecast was to all of this. Fascinating stuff.
Originally, Ike had scheduled D-Day for June the 5th, only to abort when bad weather was predicted. So it was with a feeling of incredible tenseness that Eisenhower listened to the forecast for June the 6th. This was it. The last day that month when conditions would be perfect. Even if they did the landings when the tides were right again in 2 weeks, there'd be no full moon. Quietly, Eisenhower heard the meteorologist's predictions for the morning. Probably fine with an outside chance of storms. And he said the 3 words that changed the course of the war. Okay, let's go. That morning of June the 6th, Eisenhower spoke to the assembled men. You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, the boy from North Texas told them, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
Yep.
With those words, D-Day began. The landings...
Now, here's the thing. He also wrote a speech taking full responsibility for its failure. Which is cool. I want to actually take a deeper look at both of those speeches real quick. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving peoples everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. That is a perfect tone for what these guys... Remember, a lot of these guys have never seen combat before this day. The airborne, the 101st, for example, first time in combat. Some of these guys had seen combat in Africa and Sicily and places like that, but most of them hadn't. Most of the pilots dropping the airborne guys behind enemy lines had never been under fire before. So this strikes the perfect tone of, listen, he's a tough enemy, but also we have all the reason in the world to be confident going up against him. It's really so well done. But I want to also take a look at what he had to say if it failed. So this is a note that he scribbled out. He put it in his pocket. And you see here, it says, our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. That, my friends, is leadership. You give full credit to the men who fought, and you take full responsibility for the decision to send them into combat. Takes guts.
At Normandy are the stuff of legend and could easily occupy an entire 30-minute or more video of their own. Some 156,000 troops stormed the beaches, backed up by an invasion force numbering 1 million. On June the 6th alone, nearly 4,500 Allied soldiers were killed, with another 6,000 plus wounded or missing. In the coming weeks, thousands upon thousands more would die. But it was also the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. That December, with Paris liberated, Eisenhower was made a 5-star general. Just months later, Nazi Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe, and Eich would return home a hero. Yet his reputation wasn't entirely spotless. In the last days of the European conflict, Eisenhower pulled his men back, allowing the Soviets to capture Berlin. This was what had been agreed at Yalta. Regardless, people back home accused the general of handing the communists a propaganda victory.
And that's unfortunate because it was not a decision that Eich was involved in. That was a decision made at the political level by civilian leadership, and he was just following orders.
But while the criticism may have stung, it didn't derail Eich's career in the slightest. That November, with the war in the Pacific also over, Harry Truman promoted Eisenhower to Chief of Staff. Eich had his disagreements with the president. He thought Truman had been a fool to authorize the use of atom bombs against Japan, arguing it made America look bad. But the two still got on well enough. So well that after Eisenhower stepped back from duty in early 1948, Truman suggested they should run on a joint ticket in that year's election. And it wasn't just Truman. Despite never having voted himself, Eisenhower was now being courted by factions in both parties to run for president.
It's kind of interesting to hear that he had never voted himself, because you know who else ran for president without ever having voted himself? Ulysses S. Grant. He had never lived in any one place long enough to establish residency with the rules at the time. And so, for example, in the 1860 election, he talks about in his autobiography, he said, I didn't vote in the election because I couldn't vote because I just moved to Illinois.
It was clear the public thought he was a shoo-in to win. And he would be, just not yet. Eich turned all election offers down, saying he needed to focus on serving his country. That November, Truman won a shock second term. In the aftermath, the president promoted Eisenhower to Supreme Commander of NATO forces. But 1948's brief brush with politics wouldn't be Eich's last. In just 4 short years, the general would return to Washington, and this time, it would be as Commander-in-Chief.
I believe, in the meantime, he serves as president of Columbia University.
Harry Truman's presidency officially ended on the 20th of January 1953, but really it had come crashing to an end over 2 years earlier in the summer of 1950. That's because that was the summer the Korean War broke out. The Korean War was as much a kick in the nuts to Truman's presidency as Vietnam was to Lyndon Johnson's or the Iraq War was to George W. Bush's. The nadir came when Truman relieved Douglas MacArthur of his commands, thus tanking his own popularity back home. Although Truman had now served 2 terms, the 22nd Amendment had made an exception for him as the sitting president when it came into force in 1951. Legally, he could have run again, but Korea put paid to that. With no possibility of winning his party's nomination, Harry Truman agreed to step aside. He hoped to create some space for a new generation of Democrat to take the White House. Instead, he threw the door wide open for an Eisenhower landslide.
And by the way, Truman, the last U.S. president to fight in ground combat as a soldier. We've had presidents since him that were in the Navy, for example, things like that. But the last one to serve in the Army and see combat on the ground was Harry Truman. He was an artillery captain during the First World War.
Through Truman's second term, Eich had been saying that he wouldn't run with all the sincerity of someone who is just desperate to be president. When a group of internationalist Republicans approached him, worried that their party might nominate an isolationist, the NATO commander sensed an opening. In January 1952, Eisenhower announced that he would seek the presidency as a Republican. Despite his massive popularity with the public, getting on the ticket was far from a sure thing. Primaries were different beasts in the mid-20th century, with many delegates chosen by the party. As a result, Eisenhower went into the 1952 convention unsure if the nomination would go to him or the isolationist and son of former president Robert A. Taft.
So, yeah, and he comes from the very famous Taft family. His grandson is going to be governor of Ohio a decade or so ago. Not particularly popular governor here in Ohio. It's a different time now when it comes to primaries, where basically the vast majority, especially on the Republican side, the vast majority of delegates are elected in primary elections. You have these super delegates on the Democrat side, but it wasn't always that way. You very often did not know who the nominee was going to be until after the convention was over.
It's at this point that a certain Californian senator enters our story. At the convention, Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's greatest asset, swinging enough delegates behind Ike to take him over the top. In fact, Ike was so certain that Dick Nixon had secured him the nomination that he made the senator his running mate.
Yep.
So, yeah, you could totally blame one of America's best 20th century presidents for paving the way for one of its absolute worst. The campaign that fall...
Not sure I agree with that, right? I think so much of Nixon is tarnished by Watergate and the corruption scandal there. But listen, I don't think Nixon is one of the worst presidents of the 20th century. Even close.
Was a watershed for US politics. 1952 is considered the first time TV played a significant role in an election, with the I Like Ike jingle becoming a national catchphrase.
We'll take Ike to Washington.
Although a pissed-off Harry Truman tried to sink Eisenhower's campaign by telling people, there was a time when I thought he would make a good president. That was my mistake. There was no doubt he was going to win, especially after Eisenhower made "I will go to Korea" one of his campaign pledges.
So, I think the main question with Eisenhower was, and his granddaughter talked about this with me, was not whether or not he could win the general election. I think as she put it, everyone knew that if he got the nomination, he'd get the election. The question was, would he get the nomination?
That November, Ike and Dick won an electoral college landslide, one which netted the GOP both chambers of Congress for only the second time since Herbert Hoover's presidency. On January the 20th, 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th president. One of his first acts was to follow through on his career promise. By now, the Korean War had been raging for nearly 3 years, with tens of thousands of American deaths.
So I want to back up for a second and look at that video, because I think it's pretty grainy. You got Nixon right here, who is the vice president, but I'm pretty sure that might be Herbert Hoover right there, who was very much alive at this time. I could be wrong, though. I can't tell because it's really blurry.
Promise. By now, the Korean War had been raging for nearly 3 years, with tens of thousands of American deaths and millions of dead civilians. Outwardly, Eisenhower struck the posture of a peacemaker, but behind the scenes, he tried to drop hints that the US would consider a nuclear attack on North Korea's back at China if peace wasn't forged. Today, it's thought unlikely that the threat ended the war, with the change in leadership in the USSR likely playing a larger role. But when an armistice was signed in July of 1953...
That's a great point, because right around the time that Eisenhower becomes president, not too long, I think, before this, Stalin dies. And so you have a major shift in leadership, not only at the very top, but all around when it comes to the Soviet Union. So, and remember, the Korean War is really, even though there are troops on the ground for the United Nations and troops on the ground for the Chinese and the North Koreans, it's very much kind of a proxy war, right? It's backed by the communists on the north and backed by capitalism on the south.
It was atomic weapons that Eisenhower thought had given him the edge. For the rest of his tenure, Eisenhower's official policy would be nuclear attacks on any communist nation that threatened America's allies, a policy that became known as massive retaliation. As we'll soon see, though, the reality of the Cold War would be far more complex than Ike's policy allowed. State highway program.
Yep, huge infrastructure thing that really sets up the U.S. for the decades that follow. And there's some wisdom in what we just heard, right? Even though he may have been opposed to a lot of FDR's policies, he recognized, number one, their popularity, but also that there's something to be said for not making radical changes from the previous administration. Now we hear that all the time, right? When somebody runs for president, they paint their predecessor as an extremist or their opponent as an extremist and say, I'm going to completely scale back or remove all the stuff that person did, without recognizing that even though you might oppose what they had done, radically shifting back away from that isn't necessarily always the best idea for the country.
which provided employment for swaths of people. At the same time, the president refused to lower taxes, saying it would be a waste of time. As a result, his bitterest opposition in Congress wasn't from Democrats, who retook the House and Senate in 1954, but the right wing of his own party.
And again, remember, this is a time when you still have liberals and conservatives in both parties. It's not like it is today where there's a lot more polarization. The Republicans are increasingly conservative, Democrats increasingly liberal. You've got a mix of both, and that's why Ike, as kind of a moderate in there, again, is having to use his skills as someone who can bring people together to try and keep both wings of the party happy.
Still, Eisenhower's modern republicanism worked. Across his 2 terms, unemployment mostly stayed low, inflation hovered at 2%, and families found themselves able to buy things like second cars or newfangled TV sets. While around a fifth of Americans still lived in poverty, it was a number that fell across Ike's 8 years. In short, it was a great time to be alive, with one important caveat. To get the most out of the Eisenhower years, you had to be white. Although we remember the 1960s as the civil rights era, it was very much a live issue in Eisenhower's time. The military was desegregating, the Montgomery bus boycott was about to kick off, a charismatic preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was making waves, and attitudes were changing. Among those changing were the attitudes of Eisenhower himself. Rather than pretend like everything was hunky-dory, Ike was aware that his America was an unequal one, and he was deeply conflicted about it. On the one hand, he seems to have felt that his administration could and should improve the lives of non-white Americans. On the other hand, he also had a huge sympathy for racist whites afraid of equality. You can see this internal conflict play out time and time again in the Eisenhower era. On the positive side, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Championed by Eisenhower, it was the first piece of civil rights legislation passed since Reconstruction. Giving federal protection to voting rights, it should have been a game changer for Southern blacks who were often disenfranchised.
So it's important to note that Ike, like a lot of presidents, is trying to strike a balance. He's trying to ask himself the questions about what can I do. But to his credit, he was not above doing extreme things, right? Like calling out the 101st Airborne Division to protect black students who are going to a desegregated school. So, civil rights movement, that conversation really has to begin in the Eisenhower administration. Same with the space race.
By dumbass tests or taxes. But note the operative words in that sentence. Should have. While Eisenhower had the best intentions, his legislation was just too toothless. For example, it gave disenfranchised voters the right to appeal before a jury, but in the Jim Crow South, where juries were all white, this just didn't make a damn difference. On the negative side, you also had the hot mess that was Brown and Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court desegregated education in this landmark ruling. As he usually did, Eisenhower refrained from commenting, but this time, his lack of comment was taken as a tacit nod by racist Southerners. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas felt empowered to use the National Guard to block 9 black students from enrolling at Central High School in Little Rock. Eisenhower tried to talk him down and then sent federal troops to enforce desegregation. Yet he still never spoke up for the principles of integrated education, never had a moment like JFK's famous address arguing that desegregation wasn't just the law, but a moral imperative.
And that's a fair criticism, right? He didn't use the power of the bully pulpit as Theodore Roosevelt would have called it, to use the gravitas of his office to speak up and to give a voice to people who didn't have a voice. And I think that's a very fair criticism to make.
In the end, it would be Lyndon Johnson who took the mantle of civil rights president. But that crown could have been Eisenhower's. Had he pushed just a little harder, he could have transformed the lives of millions of black Americans, and in doing so, transformed himself from merely a good president into a truly great one. As the 1956 election approached, it wasn't at all certain Eisenhower would run again. For years, he had been telling friends he'd be content to be a one-term wonder. Then in 1955, he was knocked flat by a massive heart attack. Many wondered if he'd ever recover. Yet recover, Ike did. He recovered, and he ran again for the presidency. So
at this point, he's about, 65 years old, running for a second term, which, by today's standard, not necessarily very old, but certainly older then. The life expectancy was much lower.
Even more lopsided win than in 1952. Eisenhower crushed it at the polls, sweeping even southern states that hadn't voted Republican since Reconstruction. Yet while Ike was always going to win, the margins were only so favourable because of what was happening in the rest of the world. Just a few days before the election, France, Britain and Israel had secretly teamed up to launch a surprise attack on Egypt. The Suez Crisis was the result of Egypt's leader nationalising the Suez Canal, but that's not important for this video. What is important is that none of the three attacking forces bothered to tell the US what they were going to do. And when Eisenhower found out, he was pissed. If Britain and France still had any illusions about who was the superpower, they lost them when Eisenhower did the geopolitical equivalent of spanking their asses, holding back their allowance, and grounding them for all eternity. While the crisis was a humiliation for the Europeans, it made Eisenhower look every bit the badass general like he'd been back in World War II. But while the Suez Crisis saw Ike act decisively, his foreign policy wouldn't always be so resolute. In fact, it would be more often characterized by surprising hesitancy. The same year as the Suez Crisis, an anti-communist revolution blew up in Hungary, one swiftly followed by a Soviet invasion. Given his policy of massive retaliation, some expected Eisenhower to respond to Soviet aggression. But despite, or perhaps because of his years as war hero, Eisenhower just didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to risk another war.
So remember, at this point, you've got Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, and you've got the Western influence over Western Europe, and you've got Germany divided into two separate countries, East Germany, West Germany, and that's based on the Soviet zone of influence became East Germany, and the French, British, and American zones of influence become West Germany. And so you've got this ideological divide happening in Europe, and Churchill very famously calls it an iron curtain that would descend on Eastern Europe. And so the Soviets are seeing how far can we push this, right? They're in some ways doing kind of what Hitler did in the 1930s. Okay, I'm going to Anschluss, Austria. Okay, I'm going to take the Sudetenland, and we're going to see how far I can keep pushing this. And now they're going to take Hungary, and they're going to influence elections in all these countries, and they're going to dominate Poland and Yugoslavia. The U.S. basically lets it happen.
Something similar played out in the war in Indochina. In 1954, the French requested American assistance to subdue their former colonies. As he would with Hungary, though, Eisenhower demurred. The French were defeated, and Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos became independent nations. Unlike the General Eisenhower who'd stormed the beaches of Normandy, President Eisenhower seemed to avoid a fight at any cost. At least, he did openly. Behind the scenes, he authorized the CIA to do some seriously dirty stuff. It was under Eisenhower that the CIA of infamy, the coup-plotting, government-toppling CIA, came into its own. With Eisenhower's knowledge, the agency deposed elected leaders in Iran and Guatemala, helping set up two dictators and trigger a civil war. While the other presidents would authorize more destructive actions, it was Eisenhower who first really let the CIA loose. Yet, what did his voters care? The odd Suez Crisis aside, foreign affairs just didn't figure that much into Americans' minds. Especially when...
Which is interesting at a time when the Cold War is beginning. It's difficult not to think about foreign policy, but I think people were just exhausted, right? They're exhausted from World War II, and then a couple years later, the Korean War, and now the Soviets have nuclear weapons, and you just don't want to have to think about all that stuff all the time.
When things were not going so well at home. But Eisenhower's presidency finally ended in January 1961. By then, he'd overseen the last expansion of the Union when Hawaii and Alaska both became states in 1959. Although he was broadly popular when he stepped down, there were still signs that the era of I Like Ike was coming to an end.
And that speech is well worth your time to listen to, where he rails against the military-industrial complex and really offers some very wise warnings, much in the same way that guys like Washington did in his farewell address. Now, I'm a little disappointed that they didn't really spend any time talking about NASA, right? Because the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is going to start under Eisenhower. It's going to be Eisenhower's administration that's going to decide, okay, what kind of people do we want to be astronauts, and how are we going to go about setting up a space program? That was, to me, a huge part of Eisenhower's administration.
The previous November, voters had plumped not for the continuity candidate Richard Nixon, but a young senator from Massachusetts who promised a new direction. But while Ike would live to see the whole of the JFK-LBJ era, he wouldn't be around much longer. In 1965, Eisenhower suffered another heart attack that left him badly weakened. 3 years later, he had sickened enough to be permanently checked into Walter Reed Army Hospital. He'd never leave. On March the 28th, 1969, Dwight Eisenhower died, aged 78. He'd lived just long enough to see his grandson marry the daughter of his old VP, Julie Nixon, setting up a new political dynasty.
Yeah, so his grandson David, to his son John's son, John looked just like Ike, and John is the father of Susan Eisenhower, who I interviewed. And she looks just like her grandpa too. Like, you can see that strong family resemblance.
Now he was content to spend his final moments holding his beloved Mammy's hand. His last words were, "I want to go. God take me." The America Ike left behind was already very different from the one he'd ruled. Civil rights had drastically expanded, the country was embroiled in a devastating war in Vietnam, and new social movements had exploded that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. And yet it would be this new America that came to recognize Ike as one of its best modern leaders. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Eisenhower wasn't quite a great president, even if he was a very good one. He could...
I don't know if I agree with that, though. I feel like he was a great president. I think if you're in the conversation for top 10 of all time, and I think pretty much everybody agrees he's a top 10 all-time president, I think that makes you great.
And should have pushed harder on civil rights, and his willingness to interfere in countries like Iran and Guatemala left some hot messes behind that his successors would have to clear up.
True.
Still, when you get down to it, there's no doubting that Eisenhower was a fundamentally decent man who enjoyed a remarkable career. I mean, even if he'd never become president, we'd probably still feature him in a video as the guy who led goddamn D-Day. That he managed to not just go on to become president, but also be one of the top 10 presidents of all time, speaks volumes about his abilities as a leader. And perhaps that's how he'd want to be remembered, not just as a president, but as a leader, a man who led his country through one of the defining decades of its existence. Whether you think he was a truly great president or merely a good one, there's no doubting that without him, both the US and the world in general would be a very different place.
Thank you, and good night.
So his farewell speech is fantastic. There's some really cool video available of him going back to France, England and France, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964, right before his health got bad. It's really cool to kind of follow him as they talk about all that stuff, and you can find all that stuff on YouTube. But here at the end, I will throw up a link to my interview with his granddaughter Susan, which is really, really cool. She's a wonderful lady, super smart, very gracious with her time and kind. And if you haven't checked it out already, check it out. Thanks for watching.